All right. Good evening and welcome, members of the public. There's a bad echo. Send me to that. Um, to the May 8th Open Space Board of Trustees meeting. My name is Michelle Estrella, and I am the chair of the board. I am opening up the meeting here at 6:02, and I'd like to first do a roll call, starting alphabetically with my last name, Trustee Carroll
Present.
and Trustee Glenn. Trustee Robinson
Present.
and Trustee Zuckerman.
I'm here.
And of course, I am here, so we have full representation tonight. And now let's approve the minutes from our April 10th meeting. We are going to go page by page through the minutes. And starting on page 1, do we have any questions or recommended changes? Seeing none. Moving on to page 2. Seeing none. Actually, it's really nice to have everybody here today. Oh, sorry, sir. Okay. I'm not looking at a screen for others. I wasn't going to say, I almost said that. I held back. I didn't say it, I held back. And then page 3. Wow, these minutes are just getting better and better. Nice job.
Yeah, they really are good.
They are good. Nice and concise. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up to public comment after we have Sam read the rules of decorum. Oh, sorry. Let's have a motion to approve the minutes. Does anybody want to move?
I'll move that we approve the minutes from the April 10th, 2024 Board of Trustees meeting as written.
I'll second.
Okay. Do I have to do a roll call for the votes now that even when we're all present? Okay, let's start with Trustee Carroll
Yes.
and Trustee Glenn
Yes.
and Trustee Robinson
Yes.
and Trustee Zuckerman.
Yes.
And I also vote for him, so that passes unanimously. Thank you. Everything okay? Thanks, John. Okay, now, Sam, are you ready to read the rules of decorum?
Yes, all set. I'm going to just share my screen here for just a moment. Okay. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and board commission members, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement processes, please visit this link. The following are examples of rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code and other guidelines that support this vision. These will be upheld during this meeting. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, racial epithets, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the ability to conduct the meeting are prohibited. Participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. We don't have anyone joining by phone, so I'll go over that if we do. If you would like to sign up to speak online, you'll either click the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen, or you'll see an option to click participants icon. It'll pop up a box. You'll click the 3 dots on the bottom right and then select raise hand. Tonight we have participation in person and virtually, so we're going to start with participation in person with people who signed up online. So I'll go through that list first, and then we'll move to virtual from there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sam. And it's nice to be here in person back in council chambers. I think all of us are in a bit of awe with the new technology. Thanks for the upgrade, although we still quite haven't figured out what else is going on here. But so thanks for clarifying that the people who signed up in person get to speak first. Do we have some people in the queue?
Yes, we do have someone signed up in person first. If you are in person and you have not signed up online to begin with, there is a sign up sheet on the table over here. If you could please take a moment to do that. Signed up in person to speak first is Kate Beasley. Okay, so we're just going to get the timer set up, but please go ahead and, yeah.
Would you like Miss?
Yes, you can restart.
Okay, cool. Good evening. My name is Kate Beasley. I'm the executive director of the Boulder Climbing Community, and we are a local stewardship organization. We have over 1,200 volunteers annually and about 8,000 volunteer hours. We work with community stakeholders to make climbing landscapes from Staunton State Park to Rocky Mountain National Park sustainable. For 10 years, we have partnered with open space and mountain parks to build durable and sustainable trails, the steep and rock portions of many open space trails. For example, the iconic Royal Arch Trail and First Flatiron Trails, to name a few, were built by us in part. One of the trails we have worked on at Hillbilly Rock is a climber access trail, which is part of the 10 miles of climber access trails within open space that are used and cared for by climbers. I'm here this evening to lend enthusiastic support to OSBT and to OSMP staff who will be working with our organization and the Flatiron Climbing Council to identify the next steps for all of these trails. We intend to put together a cohort of local knowledge to suggest these next steps. Because of the vast number of crags and boulders on OSMP land, determining what should be done with each of the many climber access trails would be a complex process. This is important work, and I'm glad OSMP has committed to working through it this year. We particularly appreciate the strong relationship that exists between OSMP staff and the local climbing community, as exemplified by Lisa Goncalo already meeting with us to begin the process of collaboration on this project. So that's my piece, and thank you so much for letting me present.
Thank you, Kate. We appreciate you coming here to speak on that topic. We are going to talk about climbing access trail management later in the evening, so I don't know if you're sticking around, Kate, but I think it's okay to ask any clarifying questions if you have any.
Yeah, I've
Brady.
got a quick question. You mentioned 10 miles of climber access trails. And if you don't have this information, that's fine. We can get it later. But can you tell us what that entails and what it doesn't?
Sure. Do you want me to come back up to the mic?
Sure, yeah.
So the 10 miles of trails were gone over with Lisa Goncalo. So these would be all sorts of trails going to places all throughout the system. Some of them might be spurs off trails that already exist or linking trails that already exist. Of that 10, the understanding of OSMP, which I think they're going to present to you tonight, is about 7 of them we are kind of like already mapped and known. And then there's another 3 that have to be sort of worked through. But this has all been done. Someone on staff went through and mapped everything, and they have all those details, and it's a layer on the OSMP map, basically.
Brady, some of that information will be part of our presentation tonight.
Any other clarifying questions? If not, do we have any other?
We have no other hands and no one else joining virtually right now to raise their hand. So.
Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead and close this public input session and then move on to matters from the board. This is an opportunity for my fellow trustees to ask any questions or relay any comments they had on the written memos in the packet. And this, we've in the last, I don't know, year or so, moved this up to the beginning of our agenda so that staff who might have materials in the written information section would be available to respond to any questions or comments. So I will go ahead and start with the 2024 Visitor Infrastructure Projects Update. Do we have any questions or comments on that? In here? So I'll just say that thank you for the memo. I know that we're super excited about a lot of the projects that are coming up this year. And we've touched on this a couple of times recently. So I'm just really grateful that you're doing a lot of that work. One question that I had, I know there's some mention in there about bike racks, and this is something that's, I know, top of mind for some of our community members to be able to park their bikes and then be able to enjoy open space. So I'm just looking at you, Jeff, if that you can just tell us like and I think they had notes in there about the grade of the bike parking that's going to be installed. I think everything going forward is going to be at the most like current standards.
Yes, that's correct. Each of the access points and trailheads that we're constructing this year and then moving forward will be compliant with the city rack standards, the typical U rack. In fact, just recently we've improved a couple of racks across the system, mainly like in the Sanitas area. You may see some concrete pad with the new racks. And then as we describe all the new trailhead renovations, those will also include new bike racks. So I think we've mentioned before also this season we're doing a kind of a utilization study as well to understand how many of those racks are being used and key locations where they're being used and perhaps more, excuse me, more racks that might be needed. So yeah, a lot of bike racks going in.
Nice. And I know later we're talking about the CIP budget, and is it feasible for, or is it on our slate this year to look at just sort of the inventory of bike racks that we have installed or not installed at different trailheads, and what how we might actually chip away at bringing them to the current standard,
Yes.
and how we can actually maybe look forward into our planning process to see some of those upgrades that are not occurring with the regular, like the trailheads that you're already working on, but ones that other trailheads.
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of that utilization study, that's a key aspect is to look at the full inventory of bike racks, which we've already done. Where are they? How many are there? You know, where are they located? What condition are they in? Do they meet the current standard? So that'll give us a baseline of what infrastructure is out there. And then again, the utilization study will help tell us too, like, are we seeing a high level of use or maybe need more? Or on the other hand, are they not used very much? And like what might be the factors that are, you know, people aren't using them? And I think to your question, a lot of these key capital projects, we're including bike racks in those projects. We also have some operating funding that I think what you're getting at is some of those places that aren't necessarily on a large project, but just needing to be upgraded. So we're working on some of that as well. And like I said, Sanitas Valley, that area is a good example where that's not a major renovation project right now, but we saw a need and upgraded those. In fact, I was over there this afternoon. There was 2 bikes parked right there. So it's good to see them used.
Nice.
Yeah.
I guess we can, yeah, comment on that later. It would be nice to be able to follow along with your analysis
Okay.
that you go through in terms of the utilization study. And I know that some people may not be using the racks currently because they're worried that they're not going to actually help prevent theft or whatever, or
Right.
they're just not in a place that is really usable. So if we could sort of follow along with that, your analysis, and then, you know, how can we as trustees encourage this to be a priority for the community? I know that's part of our goals our climate change goals. So I think that would be an important thing for the community, if that's a way that we can actually have some visibility and input on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning, in fact, with the citywide strategic plan that we've been discussing, there's actually a key goal or action item in that that Dan and I have been talking about related to improving multimodal access to open space areas. And it's kind of a broad general goal of looking at a variety of ways to get visitors to the open space. But I think one of those comes into play with bike racks and bike parking, you know, enabling visitors and residents to be able to, you know, ride to an access point or a trailhead versus a single occupant vehicle or taking a car, for example. So that kind of falls in line with that. I would also mention, in fact, in the visitor infrastructure memo, the written update, I put a little paragraph about some information we hope to come back this fall and present to the board related to just visitor visitation statistics, visitor survey results, and then a piece of that would be infrastructure condition, trail condition monitoring, and that sort of thing. So, Michelle, back to your point of, can we follow along when we come back? I think this fall we could probably preview or at least present some of that data we've seen specific to bike racks in that kind of context. So yeah, maybe this in the third, fourth quarter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just one other follow-up question. Is the current standard such that it would accommodate a cargo bike,
Yeah, generally.
which are longer
Correct.
and harder to kind of attach?
Correct. A lot of times we try to accommodate the cargo bikes. Those are becoming more and more, popular, and we see them more often, especially if you want to try to bring kids or cargo along with you. So basically the pad that you have with the rack would have to be a little bit larger for a larger bike, basically. And so we're trying to incorporate that. The other thing too is just make sure it's in a location that's not constrained by vegetation or trees, where you're having to pull the bike out of the trees or the bushes and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, we're trying to accommodate all the bikes that might show up. Yeah. I think the city has standards and guidelines towards, even covered bike parking and different things like that. That kind of goes a little bit outside of our wheelhouse. But we're trying to accommodate as much as we can to have visitors be comfortable parking their bikes at the trailhead. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome.
Any other questions on the infrastructure update? Okay. Seeing none, how about the Prebbles Meadow Jumping Mouse Site Conservation Team update? It just really flowed off my tongue there. All right, go ahead.
So I have a question that's precipitated by a couple of sentences adjacent to each other in the second to last paragraph, which on the one hand talks about the recovery population designation bringing with it efforts to conserve and restore stretches where the mouse is present. And then the next sentence talks about how the designation doesn't bring with it regulatory requirements or new management requirements for the lands. So, given the map and where these designated areas are proposed for, which includes some pretty popular trails, I was just wondering how do you square the two competing impetuses, the one for conservation and the one for not changing any of the management structures.
Is that on now? Yes. Well, so really the distinction would be that any conservation or restoration would be voluntary, which is really how we handle it now. There's no federal regulations that are requiring us to do restoration unless it's as a result of mitigating for impacts somewhere. So that would continue just like that. So there would be no new federal or state kind of restrictions that would make us do those things. So it would really be up to the department to continue, probably very much like we have in looking at restoration opportunities, balancing our charter purposes in those properties, and working through design processes like the South Mesa Trailhead to minimize impacts, and then work within the federal regulations for mitigation. So really what it might do is bring additional funding or support, collaborative support from other agencies to help us if we had a project that we had decided that we wanted to undertake, but it wouldn't force our hand to do anything.
So just from a sort of a practical real world perspective, does the Prebbles Meadow Jumping Mouse really suffer from being next to our trails? Or because I look at and see so much of their habitat is right next to trails, like along South Boulder Creek, and so I don't know, do you think that conservation requires moving trails, or do you think we'll be able to coexist?
I don't think we've discussed doing that. I mean, we are working on the Gebhardt project, and one of the ideas there is to focus visitor use to one side of the creek. trails do have an impact on Prebbles, and they are called out as one of the threats in the recovery plan. Prebbles are largely nocturnal, so that helps a lot as far as interaction with visitors. But we do have situations in which we have seen Prebbles either get run over by a bike or grabbed by a dog. So it does happen, less so than some other species that might be out and active during the day.
Thanks, Heather.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, seeing none, let's go ahead and turn this over. Oh, John.
Can I ask a question not about the written information?
Sure.
Question for Dan. So for the June 12th meeting, it has an action item for the North Foothills Bikeway feasibility study.
Yes.
Could you clarify what that action is going to be you're asking the board for in June?
Yeah, it's so this is a feasibility study that's ready to move out of the feasibility study and more into what we would kind of term the design, looking more at the micro levels. When we start moving along in a project, then you start getting more funding and capacity involved and time and commitments. And I think at this point, the project leads and the agencies that are involved are looking to gauge the sense of the board of how they feel moving out of the feasibility study and more into the design. Because what the feasibility study is telling us is that there will be select locations along the route that likely need to be located, not to a great extent, but located on open space lands outside of the right of way. So the result of the feasibility study is, yes, it is feasible to build a trail parallel to US 36 from the city of Boulder to Lyons, and most of it could be within the right of way. But there are a few exceptions along the corridor where it will need to stray from the right of way. So I think before we get too far along in the process, I think the project, people that are involved in the project, Boulder County especially, is interested to know, is there red flags we should be aware from those who are going to touch the project later on, such as the Board of Trustees. And I think it's just to gauge a sense of where the board is feeling about moving into moving further along into the project. So we put it as an action item because I think there is a sense that we will be asking the trustees, are you supportive of us moving out of feasibility and into design?
Does that mean you anticipate a disposal action?
That is really unclear. So bike and pedestrian use on a trail is an open space purpose. So from an open space charter purpose, it's not a conflict. And I mean, we have that situation all along. I think the only one of the main reasons of why it might turn into a disposal is who is going to take quote unquote ownership of the infrastructure. And in that arrangement, it could be accomplished through a management agreement, or is there certain elements of the infrastructure where it's better off turning that infrastructure over to another entity? We don't know that, but that's where that possibility could be out there in the future, that where it could make sense for all the agencies to get together and look at it. But from supporting a trail on open space for bike and pedestrian use, no, not that in and of itself is a charter purposes, and that would not require disposal.
That's a great question, Brady. I had the same question when we were reviewing the agenda, and I'm glad that you're looking at that 3-month horizon because it gives us some visibility in the topics that we're going to take up. When we revisit this topic next month, we're going to really talk about, like, you want the OSBT's support for just generally of the project and the potential alignment. Now, is that right? But we're not really weighing in because we don't know whether it'll be a disposal or whether it'll be a management agreement. It's kind of hard to say. I mean, I can tell you that I'm supportive of the project and think that's a much needed path for our community, a safe path through that area. But we are not really going to be able to know for some time whether there will be a disposal required.
That's right. And there'll be further touches with the board. I think this is just one of those milestones of a project that is going to be lengthy. And I think that before you get too far along in the project, that if there is big concerns, better off knowing it ahead than after you get to a certain point in the project. So I think it's a temperature gauging exercise next month is how I would describe it in a very informal way. Before we move into a next phase, which will then have a series of milestones associated with it as well. So.
Okay, thank you. I know that this was at one point controversial because the discussion was that it would be on the west side of 36, but now it's on the east side of 36.
Yeah, the topic of needing to address this issue, a big safety issue, has been on the table for a long time. So, I mean, even back in 2016 during the North Trail study areas, there was concerns raised that will the North Sky Trail be that bikeway? And if it can't be that bikeway, then we still haven't resolved the bikeway question. And the North Trail study area did a lot of planning, micro planning on what is happening on the west side of 36. And so there is a sensitivity of having a separate plan on top of that plan, and will there be conflict amongst competing plans, if you will. And so when we worked with the county to design the feasibility study, we were aiming to look at the feasibility of a trail, hopefully within the right of way to the extent possible on the east side of the trail, knowing that we just got done with a pretty big extensive planning effort that concentrated on the west side. So.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Are there any other matters from the board? Okay, great. Okay, now I will turn it over to you, Dan.
All right, great. So we've got several interesting and diverse topics for you tonight from matters from the department for all in all. And we're going to start off by a continuing conversation about our wildfire resilient landscapes update. And this was in the form, so I'm going to invite Paul Dennison to come up and join me up here, who will be leading us in the presentation. And Paul is our wildland fire senior coordinator. And as you remember, last month in your packet was a written item on this item, and to outline a new tool we are bringing to bear as a pilot project in 2024. And tonight we just wanted to follow up that written memo with a presentation and a brief presentation and a chance to answer any more questions you may have about that pilot before we go live with it pretty soon. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Paul.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Excuse me. Good to be with you again, trustees and Trustee Glenn. Nice to meet you. I'm Paul Dennison, as Dan said, Wildland Fire Senior Program Manager for Open Space. I've been with the department for about 8 months. Excuse me. And as Dan previewed, here to talk about a new pilot program that is beginning next month, the Wildland Urban Interface Perimeter Mowing Program. And Leah, you can advance to the next slide, please. Okay, so as most of you know, and Trustee Glenn, please feel free to interrupt me if any of the topics are new to you. Some of these are review topics for the rest of the trustees, and I'm not sure how much familiarity or orientation you've had to, for instance, the 2024 Community Wildfire Protection Plan. This plan and this pilot program that is emerging as a recommendation from that plan, both our efforts and planning priorities that largely emerge from the 2021 Marshall Fire. The CWPP assesses risk and recommends solutions to reduce wildfire risk. And the area of emphasis is the wildland urban interface, where undeveloped lands meet the areas where people live and work in Boulder. And those areas are the area of focus for a lot of risk reduction priorities at Open Space, and particularly this perimeter mowing program. So the CWPP has identified higher risk areas, priority areas, in terms of them areas of concern. So that was the area that we focused on in trying to identify where we could begin implementing new strategies to reduce wildfire risk. And it's important to emphasize this pilot is perhaps more specific and targeted than many other risk reduction strategies that Open Space has been pursuing, but it does complement very robust wildfire risk reduction and landscape, forest, grassland health projects, and in addition to many projects and programs being pursued by other city departments and local partners. Next slide, please. This is a map of the areas of concern. I won't go into a great level of detail, but this reflects wildfire risk modeling and also a great deal of local expertise. You'll notice that nearly all of the areas of concern are situated along the western extent of Boulder and the areas surrounding. These are typically the areas where you have the most continuity of natural areas or undeveloped lands adjacent to communities, and these areas of concern are also downwind of where we tend to experience the strongest winds and the weather conditions that are associated with catastrophic wildfire. Next slide, please. So to describe how we identified sites for perimeter mowing, and I'll get into more detail about exactly what the project design consists of in a moment. I should have introduced it a little more adequately before. It targets hazardous fuels management along these wild and urban interface zones in the areas of concern identified in the CWPP. But we wanted to target areas of higher relative risk according to the CWPP risk assessment process. So even within those areas of concern, looking for more at-risk communities. Secondly, identifying areas where open space land is in closest proximity to residential structures and communities. It's well understood and accepted that the most effective risk reduction that aims to protect homes and communities begins with the home itself and diminishes the farther you move away. So as you all know, we have many lands where our city managed lands are in very close proximity to homes, and we looked most closely at those areas where that distance was smallest. And third, where structure density is high, both in order to try to bring the most benefit to the most residents in Boulder, but also because structure density is a risk factor for home-to-home wildfire spread. Next slide, please. So this map screenshot offers a closer glimpse at the site selection methodology, or a portion of it at least. To the south, or the lower portion of the map, you can see the blue area, that's open space land. This is in South Boulder in the Shanahan Ridge and Devil's Thumb area. The red shapes are residences or structures that are within 100 feet of open space. The yellow line is the proposed treatment area. So you can see this is one area where you have a fairly consistent swath of homes that are all within quite close proximity to open space land. Next slide, please. Yes.
Can you give me a sense of the scale of that at those two, how many feet or how wide is that?
Perfect timing, trustee.
great. Okay.
I don't actually know the extent of what was just shown on the map, but in total, the 4 treatment areas that were chosen are 5.75 miles in length, which amounts to 21 acres. And the areas that we selected, the project areas we're describing as North, Wonderland, Chautauqua, and South. That North treatment area, it's a bit hard to see at this scale, but that's west of the Dakota Ridge, North Briar neighborhood. Wonderland Lake, I'm sure you're all familiar with. That also encompasses parks and recreation, natural areas that are present in that area. And Chautauqua is along Bluebell Road, directly west of the westernmost extent of that community. And the south treatment area starts at Bear Canyon, extends to the south, terminates at Greenbrier Road, where the road itself provides a suitable protective buffer, and then picks back up again and anchors into Broadway.
Can you give me the relativity? So is that is the perimeter area from here to the back of the room? Is it just 3 feet? What is that? What kind of a moat? What is that going to?
30
I
feet.
understand 30
and
feet.
you're
Okay.
right with me
great.
in
Okay.
sequence on
And-
the slides, and I do
Okay.
apologize. As I'm now presenting this to you, I should have provided more of an introduction. I think we talked about some of these concepts of project design in an earlier session with the trustees, but I realized that I probably kept you wondering a little longer than I should have in this particular talk. Let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, not just yet. I promise the next slide will include some of those details you were asking for. So the objectives in this program primarily to mitigate wildfire risk in the wildland-urban interface by reducing fuel height. This will reduce rates of potential fire spread and potential flame lengths, these two fire behavior characteristics contributing to fire intensity and destructive potential of wildfire. Almost equally importantly is to raise community awareness of and engagement with wildfire risk. As I said, the most important action homeowners can take begins with the home itself. So our goal is to engage the community so that they see this action taking place in open space and are encouraged to take similar, more meaningful action on private property. And then as a pilot program to evaluate the project and the prescriptions, which I will speak specifically about momentarily, to ensure that we're meeting the objectives in reducing fire behavior in the way that we intend to, and also to evaluate the program more holistically to ensure that it's an appropriate use of resources, that the resource investment matches the risk reduction, and just to explore how to complement these efforts with a more comprehensive strategy for wildland-urban interface risk reduction. Next slide, please. Okay, here we are. So the actual project design, it involves a 30-foot buffer starting at the fence line and extending into city-managed lands. And our goal is twice annually to use weed whackers or brush cutters. So it'll be manual implementation crews to reduce the vegetation height to 4 to 6 inches. So both the 30-foot buffer width and the vegetation height of 4 to 6 inches, both of those standards derive from Colorado State Forest Service standards for reducing risk to homes. It's referred to as the home ignition zone. And it's a bit confusing. The 30-foot buffer is a buffer that the state recommends surrounding a structure itself. We chose that width in order to ensure that every home at least has that minimum buffer distance of managed grasses. As you'll see in the next slide, there's a photograph that's representative of many of these wildland-urban interface communities, and some of them, the structure itself is at a very small setback from open space lands. So they'll at least have 30 feet, and if they take appropriate risk reduction on their own lands and in their own grasses, they'll have an even greater protective buffer. Most of these priority areas consist of primarily grass fuel types. There are some instances of woody vegetation that will be reviewed as part of pilot implementation. We have a very robust forestry program and forestry crew. And if it's recommended woody vegetation removal as part of home ignition zone standards, that may be thinned, limbed, or removed, but there are not very many instances of it, at least within the formal home ignition zone, the 100 feet from most homes. And important to note that riparian and wetland areas, sensitive plant communities, shrubs are all excluded from treatment. We won't be thinning or removing any of those types of vegetation. And the clippings from the grass management will remain on site. I'll talk in a moment about the monitoring protocol, but we will be monitoring to ensure that we're not leaving behind too much of a thatch layer. Our goal and our expectation with the two treatments is that most of that, the clippings will decompose or be blown away. Next slide, please. So this is a photograph of the north site. As you can see, homes quite close to open space lands. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an image for what a 30-foot mowed swath will look like. The implementation is being funded by the voter-approved climate tax fund that was in 2022 and provides $1.5 million for wildfire mitigation. As I mentioned, this will be manual treatment using weed whackers, and the resource is the Boulder Bridge House ready-to-work crews, and they'll be supervised by OSMP supervisors, and I'll also be out there for broader direction and an additional layer of supervision. Incidentally, Boulder Bridge House is also who prepared our dinner tonight, and they're a wonderful organization. The Ready to Work crew employs people who are transitioning from homelessness into a more stable career and life path. So we're very pleased to be working with them. They also serve over 12 work groups at OSMP, and this program is increasing their capacity, adding days to their calendar and allowing that resource to grow. So we're quite proud of that as well. Next slide.
Brian, is that 1.5 million the portion that OSMP gets, or is that the whole tax?
Great question. No, it's not the whole tax, nor is it all dedicated to open space. It's for the city, and we have a interdepartmental wildfire core team that is charged with presenting proposals and deliberating the best use for 1.5 million annually for wildfire mitigation purposes.
It was a subset of the climate tax that the voters approved, and 1.5 of the overall climate fund revenues is dedicated to wildfire. And out of that 1.5, it goes to various departments, and any given year it may change. A good part of that funding, which we'll probably update you on later, and it complements this program, as a community grants program, in order to, if folks get a home assessment and there's hardening suggestions of ways they can reduce their risk, what will complement that will be a community grant program where if you have you have income barriers to being able to take those recommendations and implement them, there'll be a grants program you can apply for to then carry out those recommendations. And that's also going to be funded through the that portion of the climate fund.
Thanks. To provide sorry.
It seems like that would be a great synergy then for when the crews go out to have brochures for the grants program to give to the homeowners.
Absolutely. We're also going to have temporary signage at trailheads, and I'll look to trail staff and others at open space to determine the best locations, but to explain the program and to also explain these complementary programs and the importance of all of these lines of effort to reduce risk comprehensively.
That's great, because I remember when you talked about how it doesn't make much difference if it's not on both sides of the fence line when we met with you at Wonderland Lake.
Mm-hmm.
So it must be pretty pleasing to see that the grant provides for both sides of the fence.
Absolutely. I'm glad you remember that encounter. I do too. And this is all of a piece with our broader community and neighbor engagement strategy. So we're not only relying on Boulder Fire and their community risk reduction program that will be providing those free detailed home assessments and administering, or at least sponsoring, the grant program to make home hardening and defensible space action more accomplishable for the neighbors of these efforts, and also other residents in the wild and urban interface. We're trying to take as much of this opportunity as we can to advertise this program, to explain its purposes, and also to explain its limitation if it's not complemented with equal or greater effort on private land. And our engagement strategy has included updates to open space websites, specifically our wildfire risk management website. A press release that was recently issued, perhaps you've seen it, direct mailers to the neighborhoods adjacent to pilot treatment areas. So we drew a distance that extended several blocks on the private side of open space to ensure that the neighbors immediately adjacent to the project were getting word, but also those across the street or nearby. Some targeted social media using Nextdoor, and amazingly, that's all been fairly well received without the controversy that is sometimes characteristic of social media platforms. We'll be hosting at least 2 informational sessions just in the next several weeks. One on May 16th at the Open Space Hub Community Room from 4 to 6. One at the Boulder Library on May 20th. And potentially on May 30th. I'm holding that as a tentative date. If we're hearing from community members that they were really hopeful for an opportunity to meet in person, but weren't able to make one of those 2 meetings, then I'll add that in. Also, direct communication through known HOAs with the communities involved. And if any of you can provide any guidance or support in this, unfortunately, there's not a master list of all the HOAs in Boulder anywhere, but they're proving to be a really helpful way of reaching the individual households. Recently, I was at a wildfire preparedness event just last weekend on May 4th that went very well with the Wonderland community, and they were really pleased to hear about this new program. And I was also joined by members of the Boulder Fire Department and Community Risk Reduction, and all in all, they really felt that they have new and just more accessible partners in the city of Boulder. So that was a really satisfactory event. And the Chautauqua community is going to be treated a little differently because of the seasonal occupancy. So I've been working directly with their operations director, and he's recommended that he facilitate the engagement with that community. He has a pretty good pulse on when those residents or occupants of those homes and cottages are in the area. And then once this pilot moves into implementation, I'll be hosting walkabouts to take any interested neighbors along the treatment areas to talk in greater detail and be able to look at the treated areas on site. Next slide, please. My supervisor, Brian Aneker, the Science and Climate Resilience Senior Manager, and my coworker, Ann Lesberg, a Senior Ecologist with Open Space, have been very helpful in designing a monitoring protocol. So this will help determine the baseline to determine the extent of change caused by the mowing, not just in fuel height, but there will be other impacts as well. And we want to ensure that those impacts are intended and desired and not unintended and unwanted. This will help us determine treatment efficacy. Am I pronouncing that word correctly? Somebody? Close enough. Thank you. You all know what I said. Also, to help us determine the ideal timing of mowing without dragging you into too much detail. It's difficult with grass to know exactly when the optimal timing is with different growth cycles and curing cycles for different plant communities. To detect unintended consequences, a major unintended consequence we're aiming to avoid is any promotion of invasive species or noxious weeds, and to collect data for modeling changes in potential fire behavior. This is really cool, and I would love to talk more with you about it if anyone's interested in wildfire modeling. And this is one tool that we have to determine if we're actually achieving the desired changes in potential fire behavior through this sort of hazardous fuels management. So we'll be looking at plant height and curing or fuel dryness, the presence of noxious weeds and any change, rare plant checks. So there are some rare plant communities that will be excluded from the mowing, and we'll be ensuring that they're thriving. It will happen continuously. We're bringing on a seasonal vegetation ecology technician, and just as soon as she joins us, so pre-implementation monitoring will take place, and then following both treatment, one in June and one in September, that staff person will be assisting with the monitoring, and it will span the treated areas and a control area. Will be quite easy with a 30-foot buffer to look at the conditions in the untreated areas right alongside the treatment perimeters. And as I mentioned, this will be done by our vegetation ecology technician under the supervision of Ann Lesberg, our senior ecologist. Next slide. Okay, ran a little over time. Sorry, Dan. Because I wanted to, okay. We do still have some time. Fortunately, I'm really eager to hear your questions, and I have several prompts for you, guidance and questions that I have for the trustees. How can the program empower and inform neighbors to conduct their own wildfire mitigation actions? Are there any potential challenges or obstacles to successful implementation that you foresee? And is there any more information that you need to be able to answer questions about this program from the community? Thank you all.
Does anybody want to start with that, or just want to popcorn around? Yeah, go for it, Sarah.
All right. Well, I am new, so I'll start. I'll just be the beginner's mind here. I think the first question is something that I can probably support with the most. You had mentioned needing or wanting more resources for HOAs, to contact HOAs. And my first thought is maybe the real estate brokers could become good partners of yours. I have a few folks that I know over at Compass in particular. I know a few of the lead brokers there are really passionate about community development and this kind of thing. So I'd be happy to make that intro. Along those lines, I also think that the realtors in our community are really passionate about informing homeowners in general. And so there could be some, and they're always looking for ways to like leave champagne and throw parties and make it fun and interesting. So that could be a different angle on community engagement. I also really commend the preservation and monitoring component of this. As somebody, I'm really passionate about wild plants, wild foraging, and of course, whenever we start to interfere with Mother Nature, there can be unintended consequences. So we don't want a lot of those invasive species. We also want to make sure that we're tending to the species that we love, that the bears, the birds, the pollinators, and all of us love and need. But it sounds like relative to the space that we have, this is a relatively low impact anyway. So my thought for community engagement there is, I mean, I have 2 children. I love to take them out for walks, and it feels like families all along the perimeter could get engaged. That one photograph that you showed, I walk past there frequently. I live up in that neighborhood, and there's a park right behind there. So opportunities for some kind of family gathering. There's also Shining Mountain Waldorf School in that area, and they've just built the new high school. So some kind of student engagement as well. It seems like ultimately my takeaway from this initiative from a community perspective is that we are all still reeling from the impacts of the fire. There's a lot of grieving. There was a lot of loss. And what naturally happens for us as human beings is that there's a fear that has been instilled in our community. And we recently have had everything shut down. We've had our electricity shut off with the next windstorm. And so there's this sense of helplessness, like the winds are coming and then the utilities are taking over, and businesses are losing tens of thousands of dollars when we shut off their refrigeration in town. So there are consequences for this enormous swing, this big reaction. And what I love about this campaign is that it's, or this effort, this initiative, is that it's providing something that feels more like, yes, we can. I kind of see that like woman, with the yes, we can do it thing. It's like, we can be looking at alternatives here. We can work with nature. So I love that messaging, and I'm so happy that we're doing this.
Thank you so much. Very insightful
Yeah, thanks.
comments and ideas.
Aaron,
Sure.
Harmon.
So not Rosie the Riveter, but maybe Wendy the Weed Whacker.
Drinking champagne in the wild and urban interface.
With champagne.
Right. So I think 30 feet's pretty much tiny in the scale of these WUI neighborhoods that we're talking about. You see that houses are at relatively low density. They have pretty big yards. The open space is vast, and 30 feet isn't much. And I think if we went back to that picture from the state that showed the zones 1, 2, and 3 for defensible space, it's so out of scale. The house is tiny, and the mitigation area is too big. And I think it might make people feel like you're going to take too much. I would just encourage you not to use that that graphic. Pick one that's to scale so people can see that 30 feet's not going to mean that you're going to mow down their entire vista. Because I guarantee you, if you put a scale on that, you will see that the 5 feet's almost like as wide as a house. It's really not.
Okay,
to scale.
that's a really helpful observation. For a moment there, I thought you were going to encourage me to mow 6,000 feet like our partners at the fire department would prefer to see. There's no limit on the vegetation management
Right.
some would prefer, but that's
why we need
really
multi-agency projects, right, to balance each other's.
But all jokes aside, I should also mention that the City of Boulder Fire Wildland Division and many other fire protection districts with wildland fire programs all agreed that 30 feet was a good reasonable distance that would give them an advantage and an opportunity for suppression without starting to compromise ecological goals and values. So, but thank you for that note about that graphic. I've looked at it so many times, I don't even think I've
I think
have a
the
critical
30
eye.
feet's like twice the width of the house.
Okay.
So nobody lives in that house doesn't look like a 15-foot wide house to me. So it just, the scale's messed up. But I think
Thank
I definitely support Sarah's idea of talking to real estate agents, because, you know, those HOAs, they know all of the different HOAs that everybody's in, and have contact information for the property manager for each one of them. So if you're looking for that and the city doesn't have a list, take Sarah up on her
I'm going to.
offer to put you in touch. And then I guess you probably already know this, but about half the houses in Chautauqua are part of the association and the other half are private. So you're going to have to figure out a way to reach both groups at Chautauqua on that. And I don't have
Great
any
advice
on that for you.
Yeah, Jason Hill, their operations director, he's a pretty insightful person, and
Good.
he's been explaining the challenges, but we're optimistic about motivating action, and regardless of the ownership complexities.
Yeah.
Thanks, trustee.
Just go to Texas and you can find all the cottage owners.
Yeah, they're in Texas. Yeah. Okay.
It's
Thanks.
true.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Other questions, comments? John? Okay, seeing none, I just wanted to say that I did see the next door post from Phil Yates. It's very brave for you all to get out there. Never look at the comments. Just, I don't spend much time on there, but I just happened to see that one. And I also saw in the Boulder Reporting Lab, the council is wanting to take like more of a strong arm on people's choices for landscaping, meaning mulch and junipers. They want to actually pass an ordinance that would prohibit people from using those materials. Nobody else read this? Did you? Okay. Yeah, I saw that. And I don't know, I think it'd be nice if people did this voluntarily. Yeah, and the Devil's Thumb HOA, I mean, if you need contacts there.
I do have contacts there, and they're quite active in wildfire risk reduction in their common areas, and are doing a lot of good work. So I expect that they'll be a good partner in all of this.
Nice. And yeah, post up signs in their pool. Their very lovely pool.
Okay.
Which we get invited to sometimes. Okay, any other ones? That's all I had.
I'll just say that I did read the comments, and I responded to one and
Okay.
got a really nice response back. So
Oh, you're a
maybe I'll
brave
just
soul. Good for you.
call that a victory and stop looking at Nextdoor from now on. Okay. Thank you all very much.
I'll be looking for you.
All right, thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
All right, we're going to do a pretty big transition. We're going to be discussing 2025 budget, and Sam McQueen is going to change hats and roles and be joined by Cole Moffett, our senior accountant, and Sam is our business services senior manager, and they're going to lead the presentation on this touch of our 2025 budget, which is going to be more CIP heavy, and give you two a chance to settle in. And I think I'm going to turn things over to Cole to begin with.
Can I ask a quick question, just for process?
Sure.
Sam and Cole, would you prefer that we hold our questions to the end?
Yes, we actually have a member from Bosque joining us towards the end, and we'll ask for questions for Bosque first, and then we'll ask for questions for us. So that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
It seems like ready to go. Good evening, trustees. Like Dan said, my name is Cole Moffett, senior accountant, and tonight myself and Sam McQueen will be presenting the draft 2025 CIP and operating budgets with a focus on CIP. So next slide. So this is a little overview of what we're going to get in tonight. An update on where we are at in the budget process, focusing on an overview of capital expenditures and the trends within over the years of CIP and some project highlights for this year, and then obviously some time at the end for any questions you all might have. So looking at our budget calendar, Tonight is the second touch of the draft 2025 CIP and operating budgets, with our first touch, if you recall, was in January at the strategic budget guidance update presented to OSBT. And tomorrow we will receive a financial forecast and budget update at the presentation to City Council, and we will distill that information and incorporate it into our third touch in June, and then the final touch for the recommendation of the CIP and operating budgets in July. So a budget process update on where we're at. OSMP recently received budget guidelines from the finance department, and these things cover like fleet repair, replacement costs, same with computer and information technology. These are costs that are budgeted by the city and then taken out of the open space fund. And open space expects to have an increase to our operating base year after year for these types of categories. And second, the first adjustment to base was submitted about 2 weeks ago to finance, and it is still in review. However, you can see a list of what we proposed in attachment A of the memo. And just an FYI, capital carryover used to run with the first ATB. However, it is now a separate process, but it runs concurrent from last year's capital carryover to this year. So continuing on in terms of budget process, so we incorporated y'all's feedback from the budget process in the fall retreat. Specifically in this process, we have already discussed strategic budget guidance with the OSBT, which was a direct result of a request to involve you all in earlier planning conversations, as well as present projects over a longer time horizon for you all to distill and, kind of share those trade-offs to allow us to pay for other priority projects in this month's memo. And just an FYI, in 2025, Open Space is preparing a fiscally constrained environment, which you will see in both our draft CIP and operating budgets. So this is kind of a high level of what.
Excuse me.
Sure.
I can't let all the terms that I don't understand just keep whizzing by. Could you define what constrained? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm happy to explain that. We'll get more information. We don't have our financial forecast finalized yet. We'll have some more information for you at the June meeting. So like we said, tomorrow night is the presentation to City Council from the Finance Department. We're going to have Finance Department staff joining us in June to talk a little bit more about it too. We do expect our sales and use taxes to flatten over the next few years. So we've seen a pretty regular increase in the last several years to our sales and use taxes, which make up like 92 to 96% of the budget for the open space fund. And so that flattening for us with costs increasing in different places is leading us to sort of plan for a fiscally constrained environment.
Which one way to think about it, Brady, is how much enhancement of a budget can we do? Can we add more staff? Can we take on more additional projects than our in a typical year? So I think the room for enhancements is going to be limited,
right,
in this year's budget.
So flat. We're not going to grow at the rate that we're used to. We anticipate. We don't know. I understand that it'll be flat, and we'll have to kind of make do with basically the level that we've been at. Is that what that means?
In terms of revenue, yes. We do know that costs for our annual operating budget are increasing. So that's where Dan is bringing in, like, we probably can't add more, even if the sales and use taxes do increase a little bit. There's not a ton of wiggle room in our budget to take on new enhancements. Okay. And we'll know more about exact numbers to show those. For now, we did share some trade-offs based on, in the memo this month, based on what we maybe are expecting. We've run some scenarios that we think we might run into next month, but we don't have exact numbers to share just yet to be able to say, like, we can only add this much or we can't add anything. But that it's sort of just our, we're planning for it in all aspects of the budget.
You can go next slide. Perfect. So what we'll be focusing on tonight is the CIP portion. And you can see the open space budget is made of the operating, capital, revenues, and reserves. And next month, we'll bring all of these together with our draft fund financial. But for tonight, we focus on capital. And so just an FYI, here are the basic elements of a capital project should typically like create, maintain, or enhance a public infrastructure. They are typically discrete projects with a defined start and end date, over $50,000, or the same type of project totaling $50,000. And CIP projects do not typically build in FTE additions. That is reserved for the operating budget. And in 2024, the CIP represented about 17% of the open space budget. And ongoing projects that do not meet the definition of CIP are in the operating budget. And here is a graph of kind of where we used to be. So 2016 through 2018, this was the end of our FEMA from the flood spending. So we were doing high dollar spendings, trying to catch up and get a lot of projects done so we could submit them for FEMA reimbursement. Then you see the dip in 2019 and 2020, and we had sales tax increments roll off in 2019 and 2020. So we took our capital budget and we planned for that and took it down. And then obviously in 2020, we had the pandemic and kind of not knowing how that was all going to shake out in terms of economics and sales tax. So you can kind of see the slow recovery up to 22, 23, and then kind of the flattening, which kind of goes back to that fiscally constrained environment. You can see that our 25 CIP is just barely a touch over 2024. So that kind of tells the story there, and we'll send it over to Sam now.
Thanks, Cole.
Yep.
So this chart shows the department's investments in the city's 4 defined CIP categories, which were created with other departments in mind. So categories like new facilities don't always show up in our CIP, but it may be represented in other departments that are constructing new buildings. So with a fiscally constrained environment in mind, the 2025 CIP will focus more heavily on capital maintenance than 2024. 68% of the 2025 CIP will focus on capital maintenance. We do have gray areas between the enhancement and maintenance categories in our CIP, so I do want to explain those. If we take trailhead projects as an example, adding gravel to potholes would be considered maintenance, but improvements to parking locations and entrances would move a project into the enhancement category. So we discussed strategic guidance with the OSBT in January, and during that conversation, we shared that the department would incorporate strategic budget guidance into the 2025 planning process. So the 3 strategic enhancements we discussed are listed here. Wildland fire resilience programming and planning will be reflected in both the CIP and operating budget, and we'll look at CIP examples in the next slide. Enhanced presence on the land will mostly show up in the operating budget, though some projects in the CIP will also further this enhancement. And looking ahead, prioritize integrated work planning really sets the basis for OSMP's work planning process. It's mostly reflected in staff time and doesn't have much funding tied to it, but you will see it in the operating budget. Even so, focusing on prioritize integrated work planning helps the department plan for emergent work while setting a 6-year vision for the department. A full list of draft 2025 CIP projects was included in the memo, and I'll start referring to those projects here. As a reminder, a majority of the strategic enhancement work will be captured in the operating budget, and here are some examples of 2025 CIP projects that do incorporate strategic enhancements. Wildland fire resilience programming and planning is reflected in the project for wildfire resilient landscapes, fuels mitigation, as well as portions of funding in the OSMP Climate Plan Implementation Project, and portions of the visitor communication and enhancement project tied to the enhanced presence on the land enhancement. We also continue to incorporate master plan guidance in the CIP with an emphasis on Tier 1 strategies. The next few slides will focus on CIP alignment with the master plan. As a reminder, our CIP projects align with the 5 focus areas of the master plan and their corresponding strategies. They are ecosystem health and resilience, responsible recreation stewardship and enjoyment, agriculture today and tomorrow, community connection, education and inclusion, and financial sustainability. Many projects address multiple master plan strategies, and we incorporate that into our calculations to show alignment with CIP projects. Here's a snapshot of strategies identified in the master plan document. Just Tier 1 strategies are shown here as an example, and the full list is included in the published master plan. In 2025, OSMP continues to invest most in Tier 1 strategies. This is consistent with the department's approach in the last 6 budget years since the master plan was approved. All master plan strategies are considered important, but Tier 1 strategies were identified for acceleration and emphasis with more staff time and funding. This table details examples of projects with some level of alignment with master plan focus areas. The example projects listed on the right have some level of funding going toward the focus area where they're listed. You can see here that projects that align with a particular focus area support a handful of topics. To walk through the top row as an example while you're reading through, the ecosystem health and resilience focus area is reflected in the projects titled Restoration of Vegetation, Riparian Habitats, and Wetlands, and the stockwater planning for drought resilience and support of diversified agriculture projects. A reminder that the full list of draft 2025 CIP projects is included in the memo. Okay. When we come back in June, we'll have the opportunity to talk about budget details again before recommendation at the July business meeting. Staff from the finance department, as I mentioned, may also be joining us to share updates and their role in the process. The June business meeting will cover important details to review the budget, as well as information that incorporates the OSBT's feedback over the last several months. We'll cover proposed 2025 operating budget changes and draft budget guidelines from the finance department, including revenue forecasts. We'll also share a draft fund financial, which will include those revenue forecasts, CIP expenditures, operating budget expenditures, and reserves. We'll have a proposed list of multi-year CIP projects and changes to the draft 2025 CIP list if needed. So I'm just going to pause here because we're going to turn our attention to the Boulder Open Space Conservancy before moving to questions. So I'll turn it over to Jeff from here. And as I mentioned, we're going to take questions for the Boulder Open Space Conservancy before we turn back to budget questions. So I'll just share that again as after we finish that.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, we want to highlight just once again for the board, this is probably a good context for the Boulder Open Space Conservancy, BOSC, as we refer to them. I think last month even Janelle Freeston had shared a little bit about BOSC, and she and I both work very closely with the Open Space Conservancy. Since 2017, they've been in operation as a public-private partnership with OSMP. And you can see here just some of the information about the Conservancy. Uh-oh. We want, yeah, and we wanted to highlight, again, one of our master plan strategies under our kind of financial sustainability is to stabilize funding. And we just talked a little bit this evening about constrained funding. And BOSC is one of these great opportunities we have within the community to kind of leverage our public resources with philanthropic donations, sponsorships, and that sort of thing. So really what BOSC is up to is they're coming alongside OSMP to really support a variety of projects. In fact, just recently, they've identified 3 key themes: connecting youth with nature, rewilding, climate resilience, and then also that responsible recreation and stewardship. So BOSC is basically working with us as staff to say, hey, what are the projects, initiatives, other items you're looking to fund and where you might need support, and how can we come alongside and do that? You can see just last year in 23, they actually brought in about 58,000, a little over 58,000 to support the department for key initiatives that you see listed there: Mount Sanitas, climate resilience, the volunteer programs, and then our junior rangers. So we just wanted to highlight that this evening. We think it's a tremendous partnership. In fact, Allison Duffy is the executive director of BOSC, Boulder Open Space Conservancy. I think she's online. She wasn't able to join in person this evening, but like Sam mentioned, she can certainly answer questions that you all might have about the program. But it's pretty common for, you know, public agencies to have these philanthropic partners at all levels. Obviously, Parks and Rec here in Boulder has the Play Boulder Foundation. The library has the Library Foundation, et cetera. So we just wanted to highlight that, and we thought it would roll in well with this kind of budget context. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So if you do have questions for Allison, you'll be able to see her. So would you, like I said, we'll take questions for BOSC first. So if you have any questions for BOSC, this would be a good time to ask those.
Does anybody want to?
I actually did have one. Thank you for all the work you and the Boulder Open Space Conservancy do, Allison. The question I had is, it looked like that money was directed to, certain programs. How was that decided? What programs that money's directed towards?
Yeah, we provide those options when donors go to make their donation. There's information about the project pillars on our website. And we use Colorado Gives for our online donations, and they can read more there also, and they can choose in the drop-down menu what they would like to give their money to.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Brady?
Yeah, thank you for the work. Are all the donations restricted, or is there a put it where you most need it option?
Yeah. Exactly. There is a put it where you most need it option as well.
Yeah. And this is mostly just individuals, or are there foundations that are donating to this?
We are building our individual giving. It is mostly individuals, and I'm working hard on corporate sponsorships as well, and grants as well. So, building all that up, but
Yeah.
mostly individual donors.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would Allison, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sarah. Go ahead. Would your organization be the vehicle in which a corporate sponsor could provide in-kind boots for our junior rangers, for example, or would that go straight to the department?
I think it would go straight to the department. Somebody else might be better able to answer that.
I know in our workplace, we're able to get a lot of free things for our crews, and I'm just wondering if that's something that you all have explored.
Yeah, I have accepted donations in my communications and building relationships with some of the local businesses. So it can go through me, but it also can go through the department as well.
Yeah, and I guess I would also just to kind of back up a little bit. We work a lot with BOSC. We actually have an MOU in that list of initiatives. John, back to kind of your question as well. We really work through like what are the true needs of the department that have been vetted through a master plan process. In other words, a project that's somewhat on the list. We just need additional funding. But if there's an opportunistic, situation that arises where someone says, "Hey, I'm a clothing provider," or some other aspect, we could work with BOSC and try to figure out if that's something that could be accepted or how that might be incorporated into the department. So yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, Sarah, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
I do, but I think we all are really excited about this and have so many questions.
It's like one of those Jeopardy game, one of those games of like who gets to press the button first. I was happy to hear. So I remember I'm trying to study and understand all of the plans and the intersection. And so these priorities that you named, which were rewilding, connecting youth with nature, and responsible recreation stewardship, the deeper dive into the programmatic priorities are aligned, and you're working together.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I think that's the critical piece is that these are projects that are community driven. Again, like tonight, we're vetting our CIP projects. These are initiatives that have been defined in a master plan process or some other plan. And then we work with BOSS to say, just like we're talking this evening, we've had to kind of be constrained, and here's some areas that might connect with a community member or a philanthropic, giving of some kind. So yeah, they're really vetted. In other words, it's not just someone coming in and say, "Hey, let's do this. How about some money?" It's a really rigorous vetting process to make sure that these are truly needs of the department, and it allows the community to really be engaged in our work as well.
Yeah, and so do you have a target for your fundraising for this year? I see what you've already accomplished. What are your targets?
Yeah, Allie, do you want to touch on that for BOSC maybe?
Yeah, my goal this year is to raise 100,000. I'm the only paid staff person, and for the last couple of years, I've been part-time, and I just was promoted to executive director with more hours. So I have a robust fundraising plan and plan to increase what we bring in this year.
Oh, great. Okay. I'll reach out to you separately. I have some ideas based on some work that I'm doing to help support.
Wonderful. Is it champagne parties?
It can involve champagne. Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to be
You're going to
invited,
be really
please.
excited, I think, when I share more, but I'll share offline. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Oh my God.
Oh, go for it, ready.
I've got a question for everybody, if I may. So are these dollars like better or easier to spend? You know, are they just kind of flow into the fund, and they're the 30,000 for Sanitas is on top. You know, in the nonprofit sector, at least, there's some dollars that are constrained, and then there's other dollars you can do anything with. And so how do you think about these funds?
Well, Sanitas is a good example. So Bosque has had a really kind of deliberate campaign with Sanitas. You guys have probably seen the posters up at the trailhead and, help take care of Sanitas and that sort of thing. So when that funding comes in, it really does go in and allow us to support Sanitas specifically. And in other words, it's basically constrained and directed specifically to that area. In fact, not to get too far into the weeds, but we've been recommended for this amazing grant through the Land Water Conservation Fund with great support from Bosque and kind of being a partner in that. And so they're really trying to come alongside and see if they can raise additional funding that could provide that match money, for example. And so in a lot of ways, again, in this constrained environment, the funding that comes in then allows us to do more in other places, or kind of go above and beyond what our current funding would allow. So it really does provide more capacity, more reach for us. Yeah. But again, this goes right to our trail maintenance backlog, which is a tier 1 strategy, and really for the community to know that these dollars are going right to what the priorities are.
Yeah, I think Brady, the best example of the leveraging, I think it was in 2023. It was the Sanitas project, but Bosque's additional funding allowed us to deploy helicopter deployments of our rock equipment. Otherwise, so it actually sped up what we thought we could do in that given year because we didn't budget in the ability to do helicopter transport. We used Bosque's extra funding to then deploy the helicopter, which allowed us to bring up equipment, mainly rock, that we didn't think we could do in that given year. So we were actually able to do more work than we were able to do in our existing budget line item for that.
Yeah. And then you could say the taxpayers weren't paying for the helicopters.
Well, that's true. Well, yes, I'm on record for saying that.
They're electric helicopters though, right?
Yeah.
There is something really important about having this vehicle for members of the community to give back. There's so much that we value here in this open space. It is one of the most important assets that we have in this world, in this country, actually, not just here in the city. So I'm excited to support you, Allison, and excited that we're doing this.
Thank you so much.
So, Jeff, it says that the LWCF grant, so I assume is more than $1 million, has a successful application. So I don't want to count chickens because I guess the money's not here yet. But I guess the question I have about this is that it looks like Bosque worked with OSMP to make this application, this successful application. How do you work with Bosque? And Allison, if you want to answer too, how do you work with the city to identify the kinds of grants that are out there that require a community partner so that you can tap into more money like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm kind of smirking because today we were actually just looking at a King Soopers grant that Janelle actually had found. And I think it's just kind of opportunistic. And Allison, I'll let you kind of touch on all the research. And I think it's more, a lot of times they bring in ideas and thoughts. So.
Yeah, it's just that I have 20 years experience in grant writing and nonprofit fundraising, and mostly in environmental education and for environmental nonprofits here in Boulder. So I keep an eye on all the foundations that I've worked with in the past. And then we have a board member who's very active in in state and federal funding opportunities for conservation. And so we just send them off to Jeff and Janelle to take a look, and then we kind of put our heads together to see if it's something that we could work on.
Yeah. And truly, that's kind of with the LWCF, Land Water Conservation Fund. Eric Washburn, who she's mentioning, was really highlighted that to us and thought that'd be a great project. And frankly, we were pretty shocked that we were successful. In fact, we were number 2 scored in the application, which was really impressive. So it's exciting. We're still in the pre-award. It's not officially, award contract, but pretty successful. That's just one. We're starting to really work with Bosque, I think, in those kind of venues.
Well, thanks for that.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like it is informal and opportunistic, but that's fine. And that's it looks like folks are passionate about it. So it's probably the best kind of system that it could be right now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Allison or Jeff on?
I'd just say one thing. It's clear to me that this has an impact way bigger than just the grant making that we saw, and it's super impressive. I didn't realize that this sort of partnership could unlock LWCF dollars, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And I appreciate that. I mean, that was kind of our goal tonight, is kind of in this context of budget and funding to kind of make sure we highlight this great opportunity and frankly, kind of work more with OSBT and Bosque and the staff. So thanks, Sam and Cole.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I want to
Resume
throw in
normal
that we're talking about constrained environments, and that's almost like a bad word in my world. So I'm loving that this kind of opens up some new possibilities. I'm always thinking, how do we get around the constraints? So that's good.
Okay. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I won't bother pulling up the slide. Our question for you is, does the OSBT have any questions about the 2025 draft CIP list or operating budget? And I just also want to point out that Lauren Kilcoyne has joined us, so you'll see her on the screen as well, and she'll be available to answer questions also.
I'll make note that we also sent some of you provided some written questions over the last few days. And looking at them, at first we thought, oh, we'll just answer them individually, but then we thought the collective responses that we have to the individuals would be informative for the full board. So we included you all in our responses to those individual questions, provided some more context on cost allocation to support next month's meeting. So we wanted to provide more background on what it is, and because it is a sort of a nebulous term for a lot of people. So if you haven't seen that come through your inbox yet, it was Lauren helped put that together on the fly on her free afternoon hour or two. So I just wanted to make sure you all knew that that's in your inbox.
Thank you for that, Dan. I found that email to be very helpful, by the way, Lauren. I guess, how would we like to go about the questions? I would like to just say that, we're in the month of May. This is our second of 4 touches. And what I like is that we're actually engaging pretty early on in the process. I think in the past, and maybe in my past lives and previous boards, people sort of wake up to the questions later on in the budget season. And then at that point, we feel like maybe there's not as much time to rejigger things or really have meaningful input. So I'm glad that people are engaging on this early. I hope you are too, even though that ended up with a lot of questions. So I just wanted to set the stage for that, and then we could go by person or we can go by topics. And if you are passionate about starting, raise your hand. Okay. Okay, go for it, Harmon.
So maybe not passionately, but I will start. Yeah, I just, I think this is a big chunk. It's not obviously the whole budget. It's the capital portion of the CIP is 17%. And I think the report did a great job in showing us how the money breaks down and how the money is tied to the different priorities that are in the master plan. I like the direction that things are headed in the, as I think somebody said, rejiggering, where the allocations are going towards different master plan areas. And I don't really have any questions. I just want to congratulate you on a nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harmon. Others? Oh, go ahead, John.
I'll echo what Harmon said. I know, we asked you to redo the process for us, and it's been really great to see this earlier. And just in general, the information's become more clear in the 2 years I've been reading the packets, and really appreciate the effort you all have put into this. It's been getting better and better to read through every year.
Thank you.
Sarah, Brady?
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for the rejigger. I thought attachment B was really complete and extensive. And I know I hesitate to complain about the length of the packet in the presence of a former planning board member. So I get this is light duty, but it did seem like maybe there was a little bit of superfluous information in there.
I apologize for that. That was me. We wanted to present to you the city's strategic plan that has not been shared otherwise publicly. That was our way to do it, and I tried to highlight the pages. So I apologize. I know, Michelle, you may have read even more of it. So just if you did read more of it, I hope you saw some context in there that was helpful. But yeah, the goal was really to share that strategic plan, which at some point will be pulled out and shared more, so you can have one document to take a look at. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, the extra 50 pages helped me get to sleep a couple nights ago. Sarah, you go ahead.
Well, I'm the new kid on the block, so I'm going to be using this season to really observe and learn. What I'm hearing and feeling a lot is a good collaboration between this board and the staff. And I know, Michelle, you've really been an advocate for getting ahead of this, so I want to acknowledge you for that. And I also I know it was a 2-hour process at least, Lauren, to get that email together. The responsiveness of your team is really incredible and the time you're taking on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, great job. This is my 9th season looking at a city budget, and I still have to be like, okay, what does that mean again? Because it's just done differently for municipal financing. But yeah, I think it continues to get better and better. Thank you. I have 2 questions. One around the climate tax fund. How do those dollars typically get spent? Are they going to be in the operating phase then, or would we see any of? And we'll see the ins and then the outs, but the outs may be a little less obvious because they'll be baked into operating and CIP, or mainly operating.
So I can answer, and then if others want to jump in as well to share some context. So the climate tax is its own fund. It has its own fund, and it's managed separately. So when we share open space fund information, it won't be included in those numbers. So next month, when we come to you with a fund financial and some other documents, it won't include those climate tax numbers. If we do receive allocation in 2025, we'll include that in the memo and say, you'll see in the climate tax fund when the budget is published that OSMP is receiving X amount for this type of project. In terms of how we handle that internally and find projects that we would like to propose for the climate tax fund, through our work planning process that we do in late summer, early fall, before the next year's planning process. So that for the 2025 budget, this would have been in 2023. We use the exact same system. So we use our work planning software to collect projects that are of high importance. We go through our directors team, reviews the projects and prioritizes them against our plans to put forward as part of either the CIP, and then in that process also identify things that may be good candidates to put forward for the climate tax. And then the climate tax fund has its own team that reviews proposals for spending and then ultimately gets reviewed by the executive budget team. I could have missed a step in some of that review on the climate tax side, but we use our normal work planning process to propose projects for the climate tax.
I think by the time we actually submit the budget to the city manager, we have a pretty good, a high degree of confidence of whether or not we're going to be awarded, because the wildfire core team and executive team has already sort of seen the proposal for how the 1.5 will be spent and sort of puts their stamp on it. Then it goes out to the executive budget team in the city manager's office. But at that point, we feel relatively confident that what we're lining up between an expenditure and a potential revenue source of the climate tax, that we're pretty confident that that alignment's going to happen.
Okay, that's helpful. Going back to Paul and Brian's work on the WUI. So the ready to work crews, when they're out there, and it sounds like they're doing manual weed whacking and mowing, not using machines and doesn't disrupt the neighbors. Those crews, do we pay them directly, or do they get funded by the climate tax?
Indirectly, but directly to open space. It's a contracted service. So maybe
So open space
you'd be able to
pays
explain
for
it
it.
more.
Do we get reambused by the climate tax
Yeah,
fund
we'll
for
get
that work?
reimbursed.
Okay, so that's
It's
how
sort of like
that'll.
getting a grant in a way. A reimbursable grant would be one way of analogizing this.
Okay. So in some ways, when we look at the fund financial, like they're going to, that particular example of an expense is going to show up in our operating expense line. But it'll be offset by revenue from the climate tax allocation.
So we won't put it on our expense side in the first place, so it won't show up in the fund
Oh, won't.
financial.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll maybe front the cost, and then Cole will do some cleanup before the end of the year to make sure it gets charged to the right place, the climate tax fund in that case.
Gotcha. So you'll originally make sure they get paid, and then you'll actually
Yes.
charge it to a different fund. Okay. So when we're looking at so we wouldn't see the expense in this budget then.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
You will see other ready to work expenses. So we do have regular programming with them that is paid for out of the open space fund that will show up in the open space fund financial, but the climate tax portion will not.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm tracking now. Thank you. Is it on the climate tax? Otherwise, I'll keep going. Okay. I'll keep going, and then we'll hand it over to Brady. I have a question because we are in the CIP stage, and I brought up bike rack infrastructure earlier. So we're in May, we're reviewing the CIP and these are projects that are going to happen in 2025. If we don't prioritize installing bike racks at trailheads that are not actually having work being done already, does that mean that we wouldn't even be able to begin any of that work until 2026? Like there's no space in this particular budget cycle to have any influence on work like that? Because I know you have to do the utilization models and all of that, and we're going to miss the boat on 2025 budget.
Well, again, the CIP list you're seeing are those $50,000 and up projects. So those ones where we're going to be investing in trailhead improvement infrastructure are those major projects which would incorporate the bike racks. But if we're just doing a single bike rack replacement at an access point or a trailhead, that wouldn't show up in the capital portion of our budget. We would be utilizing operating funds, which that program area would have available to them to then say, yeah, okay, out of that operating pot that we have, let's spend a little bit on bike racks, a little bit over there. And there's more flexibility for that program area to determine what their priorities are.
Okay, so I am following you, unless we made a wholesale decision that we wanted to say $100,000 is going to take care of all of our trailheads. And then we could say it would fit into the CIP. Is that right? If we just said, okay, we want to allocate 100, whatever the number is, that's over $50,000, and we said this is going to be a project, we'd allocate it this year, but it would be, spent down in future years, then it could fit into a CIP. Is that right?
Theoretically, it could. Yep.
Okay. Thanks. I'm going to go back to my PRAB days because Jeff, you know the story, but when Bob Yates and I served on PRAB, we were actually able to influence the Bill Bauer Park and get that actually done because we had visibility, and there was a project that was like waiting in the wings for a long time but didn't have funding, and it was one of those instances in which we were able to say, okay, how could we make this happen? And that felt like we actually had some power to do that. And so I understand that this could take time. I know it's also part of our grander goals as a city. So I'm just wondering, like, can we actually influence something like this in the next 2 years or not? Other than à la carte, sort of
Yeah.
weaving it in.
So I guess I would start by saying, like we've described, in fact, some of the next item is going to be about Sawhill Ponds and all these capital projects that are already in the CIP, specific to bike racks, bike parking. We've incorporated or integrated that into those projects. And so one of the things we could do is come back next budget presentation and talk about all the bike rack work that we are doing with that's already included in the budget. And then, if you as the board were to say, well, we want to, expedite that or enhance that and kind of have it more, have it done more quickly, then we could, I could also look at what is our asset management, our backlog. Like I said, we are doing an inventory. We're understanding rack locations that need to be either replaced or increased. And I could come back with like a dollar amount of what that might require. So yeah, that's one way to do it, just like any other type of project. If the board says we would like to really, kind of enhance or expedite this area of focus, we would come back with information of how we could do that. I would say just off the cuff that I think right now, in terms of the work we're doing, we certainly can't go system wide and just replace everything and make it like new and with the funding we have now, but I'd say we're doing probably a good job of replacing as needed and as part of these ongoing projects as we're prioritizing all the work we have to complete, if that makes sense.
Understood. There
Yeah.
are some people who think that we could be doing it better and faster.
Correct.
Am I alone in this particular line of thinking? Do you all support sort of trying to make this a priority, or?
Well, I don't know that much about it. So is your sense, Michelle, that we're not going, you talked about other people, but is your sense that we're going too slow, or are you worried it's going to fall through the cracks and you want more visibility on the total spend, given that the individual projects often fall below our CIP threshold? Like what's the root kind of concern?
Well, I know that we, in the last several board meetings, have talked about multimodal access to trailheads. So it comes up fairly regularly, and how can we, get to trailheads in a more green way, including just the recreators and also and workers and public transportation and all these things. This seems like it fits within what we want as a community. And then I have seen myself that some of the racks just don't accommodate. They're just not built to the current standards, and also I've heard complaints that they're either not present at all, or that they're not easy. They're not realistic to even use. So I think that there is a sense in the community, not just me, but that we're just not keeping up with what we say we're going to do. And actually like making that a priority. We talk about it being a priority, multimodal access, but we're not actually making an effort to make it a priority. So just reconciling those two things. We hear about it regularly in our different meetings, but actually not feeling like we're doing anything about it. Go ahead, Harmon.
So looking at the list of the matrix of the 2025 CIP projects, the biggest single line item at 1.4 million is this trailhead improvement projects to support accessibility, visitor experience, and responsible recreation. And I guess I'd ask Jeff, is there a lot of bike rack money in that 1.4 million dollars, and is there some way to highlight that if it is?
Yeah, in that project in particular, there's certainly bike racks. Not a large percentage of the 1.4 million. When you think about infrastructure, the racks are relatively inexpensive compared to like a new restroom or parking, shelters and that sort of thing. So again, I think as a staff, I would recommend we're able to keep up with the demand and provide, replacement of the ones that need to be repaired and replaced. Yeah, we hear requests and from the community and, perspectives of like the racks aren't to the current standard. I don't feel comfortable locking my bike to that. all the things I mentioned earlier. So we could advance that. We'd have to maybe prioritize that among other infrastructure that we're trying to replace as well. So again, I think if it's a goal of, and that's, I think the goal of this budget item is to kind of say, here's the projects that we've scheduled and the reasons why. If the feedback is, hey, can we hear more about bike parking, bike racks in particular, and what project might be, moving that forward, that we could come back with more information. But yes, certainly within the projects that are scoped, there are racks. That's, for example, that project is primarily at South Mesa Trailhead. And so we're just talking about one location. And that's kind of how we're going about this, is as we go to these renovations, we do a full renovation. Last month you heard about Marshall Mesa, South Mesa. Tonight we're going to talk just a little bit about Sawhill Ponds. And again, in our operating budget, we have replacement funds too, that we're doing work outside of the CIP. And so again, next month I could provide a little more detail as to what we are doing, the capacity we have with the funds we have, and what it might look like to advance that or expedite that, what that cost would be.
Are you nodding that you would agree that you'd like to see more information?
Well, yes, I would, and I would support you, Michelle, in saying that bike racks at trailheads should be a priority. I think that, as people move to a lot of e-bikes for primary transportation or for supplemental transportation, I'm sure that staff can look and see which trailheads are, really right on a multimodal trail or something like that, that kind of invites more people to show up. Even if it's not a bike friendly trail, people might ride their bike to go hike rather than get in the car to go hike. And we all know that some of these trailheads are extremely parking challenged. And so being able to slip in with your bike and get a spot right at the trailhead, it's a nice thing. So I would agree with you. I think, out of that 1.4 million, it would be great to see some of that directed at bike racks.
I'll just point out, so Jeff's team is obviously taking an asset management approach. Let's inventory what we have, what conditions are they in, prioritize the upgrades, probably come out with a sequencing plan attached with funding for, by such and such a time will be completed around the system. So that's sort of a staff mentality of approaching a subject. We're hearing from our trustees that could you daylight a little bit more about that methodology as it goes along? And is there any way to enhance that effort or expedite that effort? So hearing that, I'd also just bring attention to, in your reading in the strategic plan, 7.C actually is a very specific of all the work of the hundreds and hundreds of projects that the city is doing. One in particular that open space has been asked to lead is 7C, which is looking at identifying key open space access points throughout the city and identify multimodal options for greater accessibility to those. Now, this plan is fresh. I just got tapped last month by the city manager to say, can you work with the other departments that are going to be a part of that and come up with a short, a medium, and long-term strategy for this effort? And so I just wanted you to know that there's a few department directors that are sort of convening, putting our muscles together about what this looks like, what would be some immediate steps, what would be some medium-term steps, long-term steps. So it's got the attention, not just bike racks, but also direct transit, shuttle. I mean, what are all those tools that are on the table for multimodal at key access points throughout the city? So it also has the attention of citywide focus through our citywide strategic plan.
Thanks, and I know that working group is very helpful, and I'll read that 7C again. We talk about being carbon neutral by 2030. So I'm honing in on the dates here. So this is the 2025 budget. If it's not somehow baked into the 2025 budget, we don't get another bite at the apple until 2026, unless it fits in conveniently in our operating budget. And now we're talking about constrained budgets. So in our operating budget. So I'm just trying to balance those two things and be like, okay, I mean, during my tenure on this board, I would love to chip away at that and see that we're actually doing something tangible. And I mean, direct transit's wonderful and super hard, and like all these other things are wonderful and also super hard. bike racks don't seem that hard. It's just about us, I think, making it a priority and saying we're going to do it and we're going to find the money for it and we're going to build it into our work plans. And it may be a matter of convenience because we're doing a trailhead redesign anyway, which is absolutely the way to go. But we can also say we value this and we're going to find a way to get the rest of the system upgraded as well.
Right.
Okay, and then I'll let it there. Like,
No,
okay.
I think those are great points.
I'll
and
say
I,
something.
And I,
I'll say something.
yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
I actually really love this because at first I was actually over here thinking, okay, bike racks, bike racks, is that even like how glamorous are bike racks? And then my mind went back. I actually co-produced an event in Amsterdam. I spent a lot of time in that city. And if you haven't been to Amsterdam, it's such a vibrant, lively, amazing, creative city. And it's heck expensive to live there, right? So the real estate values are high, in part because if you go on the streets, there's a walk pedestrian sign, there's a bike sign, and then there's also a car traffic sign. Every bus is packed. All the sidewalks are full. The people are happy there. So I've actually made a recent commitment to ditch my car. I even refused Michelle coming to pick me up. I was running a few minutes late for the meeting because I take the skip down Broadway and then I walk. And this includes my dedication to being up on those trails every day. So I consider myself to be an early adopter and a very worldly person. And I actually think it's quite glamorous for us as a city to think about this vibrancy and to have a quick win like bike racks. I think it's fantastic. And so I'm in full support of it. And I hope that we could take this as an initiative as one small win, which in the theory of behavior change is always good. We like those little wins to expand out a story about vibrancy. It makes us all healthier and happier when we're walking and biking places. And we may not need to, just go cram into the gym for that extra workout if we're walking the extra mile or biking the extra mile. And we might say hi to our neighbors or recognize a new house along the way. So I'm in support.
Yeah,
Thank you, Sarah.
that's great feedback. I'll just repeat, we are doing the bike parking, bike rack utilization study. So there's, in my mind, I'd really like to talk with the staff and just get some points of like where best could we improve bike parking using the data we have now, the asset management. And I agree with the vision, to really, I think the community has kind of spoken that as well to make it a little more bike friendly to arrive at trailheads and access points. So.
Is there any interdepartmental, like Department of Transportation, are there ways that we can all collaborate on things like this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what Dan that's one of our key goals is the strategic plan that he referenced. There's a key strategy about, multimodal access to trailheads and access points to open space. So that'll involve a working group. Certainly our transportation planning team, they're always working on transportation options for our residents and visitors other than single occupancy vehicles. And, so this falls right in line with that. And we can certainly bring some of that information as well.
And so you're going to look into the utilization, Jeff, and is the presumption here that bike parking is actually the constraint? Is that why people aren't why people aren't biking to these places is because they don't have a place to park?
Some of it is that, and some of it is the bike racks that are existing are not to standard. So if you want to get out of your car and take your bike or e-bike and say, okay, I'm going to go the 2 miles to get, because it's, you only have so much time, right? And you don't have the convenience of living right there at Chautauqua and then not having to pay a parking fee and all of that. This is one way you could get there, and then you could actually leave your expensive e-bike there and feel like it's not going to get stolen, and then be able to go for a hike or whatever, or go for a run. I don't know about going climbing off, it's a lot of gear, but I'm sure it can be done. But I think that is my understanding, is that it's a constraint, and it is something that people want to do more of, is to be able to get to the trailhead without using a car. And bikes are an obvious way to get there.
Yeah, and I mean, our human dimension staff, I'm sure they could engage and kind of get feedback from the visitors. Human dimension, where they do our visitor surveys and data collection to understand, what are those barriers, either perceived or real, that prevent biking, whether it's just pure strength going up a hill or the right parking amenities, all those kinds of things. So that's part of what that study was hoping to accomplish this year as well. So it's a complex issue for such a simple amenity, you know, like you mentioned. So, yeah.
Well, what I'm hearing is we'll take what staff does to complicate things and make it bureaucratic, and we'll attach some funding, some funding options to it of how the results of all this could be funded and when. So, and we'll come back next month with what we know further, and we'll make sure we emphasize this area. And of course, we'll go back and start talking about this utilization study and say, okay, so the results are going to come back. How are we going to prioritize it and fund it?
Thank you. It's only taken me 9 years of figuring out the city budgets. So like, if you want something, you've got to actually plan ahead and like plant that seed ahead of time, because otherwise you're too far behind on the work plans.
Can I shift gears to a different question? Are we gonna? I am on page 15 of the PDF, and I'm looking at table 9, draft 25 CIP funding by master plan strategy. And I was just noticing here we have welcome diverse backgrounds and abilities, and one of the highest items being funded in this $7,789,492 budget is this the welcome diverse backgrounds and abilities. And I'm curious to know more about what are we, I love that we're taking this initiative and we're putting dollars behind it. What does that mean? What are we doing?
Yeah, so I can tell you the projects that go under that. We have 4 projects that tie to that. It's development of a food forest on an open space location, high quality trail network in reducing trail maintenance backlog, Mount Sanitas Trail Improvement Project, and trailhead improvement projects to support accessibility, visitor experience, and responsible recreation.
Great.
Do you have any other questions under that piece? Okay.
That's
Yeah.
helpful. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, Sam, I'm surprised you didn't mention the Fort Chambers Poor Farm site management plan as part of that. Or could you add that to the $784,000?
So there's always the complicated piece of, we gave an example in the memo of how we tie the master plan strategies to the, each project to the master plan strategies. It is a very complicated task. It's not hard to do actually in our system, but it is, there is a lot of review and conversation that happen. So our project managers have conversations with their teams to make those types of decisions. And then once it's submitted and reviewed as part of our work plan, there's a lot of back and forth. So even as we're preparing packets, there's some questions that come up and we make decisions about how we tie different projects to the master plan strategies. There is a lot of interconnectedness. And so one of the things, for instance, we tried to point out in the memo is that even though there may be a little bit less spending in one of the focus areas, there is so much interconnectedness with some of the other strategies and other focus areas, and we do the best to tie our primary, secondary, and tertiary to those. But yes, you will find some surprises sometimes, and I think we would agree with some of those surprises.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was kind of struggling with that as I was going through the master plan areas myself and thinking, how do they fit those things? So many things fit into 2 categories or something. Well, I guess, I don't know if, Dan, you probably are interested in us moving on. I could tell maybe. But I did want to say, just to sort of get it out into the record, that I was very, I was really impressed with the take care of what you have focus of this year's CIP. I saw about 80% of the projects were continuing and about 20% were initiated projects. So, really trying to focus on, fixing issues in the system and, taking the acquisition stuff out of CIP this year and really just focusing on the maintenance, the upgrade, the enhancement of what we have. I think that for me, that was the headline. And I think I hear some community criticism around, why are they always buying all kinds of new land, and stuff like that. And so, I think that's exactly not what we're doing this year. And I just wanted to say that in a very clear way. I hope I did.
Other than the land exchange, as I would call it, out at Sunboro with Boulder County, we haven't purchased a piece of land, I think, in 5 years now. And all that investment, which was up to about 6 or 7 million for acquisition fund has all been turned in, and we've been trying to reinvest it into taking care of what we have. It's been a very deliberate strategy.
I think we have one more question from Brady, and then we'll move on.
I just want to commend Harmon on a great observation and a pretty good impersonation of somebody. There are budget hawks among us who are watching our sources of revenue very closely. And the lottery fund allocation came up, and I sent that forward, and you all responded. And so my understanding is we used to split the lottery fund with Parks and Rec and the exec
And
cut me
Greenways.
off.
And Greenways. So
And Greenways.
three funds were Open Space, Parks and Rec, and the Greenways program. Traditionally, have received the funding for that money.
Traditionally, right. And my understanding is that Parks and Rec they are having a relatively harder time finding consistent, dependable sources of revenue, and therefore the executive budget team decided that that allocation would go to Parks and Rec and not to Open Space. And is that so? Do I have that right? And is that something that we can expect to happen going forward? Is this the new normal in terms of our traditional funding?
Yeah, I don't yet know if we have a new normal. So I'll say that. I think that there was a decision in 2024. We're expecting a consistent decision in 2025 that Open Space will not be a recipient of any lottery funds. I believe Parks and Rec was the sole recipient in 2024. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case again in 2025, but the executive budget team has not started looking at that level of detail. But as far as ongoing, what happens, one idea we've been floating for is what is a new way of looking at it, that rather than just every year is could it be more of a sort of like a grant fund where you put in an application to receive some lottery funding, that any departments that would qualify for what the lottery funds can be used for could put an application in. That's one idea that's been floating out there. So we really don't know ongoing what would be that new tradition that one would look back over 10 years and say, oh, this is what we do with lottery funds. I don't think the city's there yet. I think the 2024 decision, I think, was based on what the city viewed as a higher need. And, but going forward, I think I particularly would hope that a more consistent approach would be put together so everybody would know sort of what's in play and what's not. But
and I don't mean to insinuate that it's not a
Yeah.
good thing that you can sometimes decide that something is more important than another in a given year. I just also think that some of the more passionate, friends and defenders of open space, once we see a revenue stream, we feel like it's ours.
yeah, no, I mean, yeah, if somebody's been looking at the Open Space Fund for 20 years and for the past, decade or so has been used to seeing this money, I personally could see how that is viewed as a loss. But when you take the citywide perspective and you look at everybody's department who could qualify for the definition of lottery funds, and you mix and match where the greatest need is, I can't fault a system where in a given year they determine that there's a higher priority.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Eli, that was not the last question. I want to reconcile what you just said, though, because about like not getting a 2024 allocation to the lottery fund. And also now we're seeing that we're not going to get one for 2025. I just like, is my memory wrong? But I went ahead and pulled up the July 12th packet in which we were asked to, July 12th, 2023, where we were asked to make a recommendation on the lottery fund budget. And so so what happened there? We approved or recommended a budget.
Yep.
Later on in the process, they said, you're not going to actually get that $400,000. And then did you say, we're not going to do this subset of projects then?
I think we ended up finding a way to fund that particular project that we had tied to lottery fund, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think we needed to shelve it.
We absorbed it in the open space fund.
So you absorbed it. And so that's not something that, I mean, clearly I wasn't following this during the October phase when you're talking to council and whenever these decisions were made. That feedback loop doesn't come back to us like, hey, this thing that you approved in July, you know, you didn't get that funding and we found other ways to do it?
Yeah, that I think it came in. I was going back to some documents earlier, and it ended up coming back as an email. I think that is and Lauren, jump in if I miss anything here. But when there's a change at the end of the budget process, so after you make a recommendation, we inform you in different ways. The last couple times it's happened, it's been an email that we send out that says, after executive budget team review, which does happen typically at the same time as you're making a recommendation, we'll come back and let you know if there are any changes.
Yeah.
And that was one of the ones that came.
Yeah, I thought we did inform the board about that.
It was an email. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's informing the board. Well,
It is informing the board. It just is not like as obvious because we think, oh, we approved it.
no,
and,
no, true.
you know.
And it's
Yeah.
we're upfront in this system, right? So you all help us formulate what we want to provide to the city manager.
Yeah.
And once we give it to the city manager, there's that whole the end of the process of executive budget team recommendations and city manager making the final decision. And that's all happening after you've all weighed in. So the timing, what we would like to do is be able to hear your advice so we could put in a budget to the city manager that reflects what you're saying, rather than you're trying to build it into a council voice and you're dealing with a $500 million budget and you're talking about bike racks to council. Like, we would rather try to build that in before we give it to the city manager. So that's kind of the sequencing we have here. But there are decisions that are made after these deliberations we have with you.
I appreciate that. And I just, for the record, don't disagree with how you came up with that. And deciding that and I used to be on Parks and Rec Advisory Board, that they needed that money this year. So I don't disagree with that. And I think it should be a decision that the city is able to decide, okay, what is the department in most need? So I'm not disagreeing with that, just wanting to make sure I'm tracking with how the decisions are made and how we sort of keep on top of decisions so that we're not like, oh, we're in May and oh, by the way, we didn't get that last year. I was like, oh, well, clearly I wasn't paying attention enough to know that we actually didn't get it last year.
Dan, this might be a brief, helpful topic at a future touch. Just like, we're up here sitting behind these microphones, but what's the limit of our influence and power over the budget, and what's our role as per the charter and kind of culturally, and maybe helping us set our own expectations on what are the boundaries of our responsibilities, and how can we be most helpful as well. Because I can sense that it's complicated. We only get a little piece of it, and it might be a good 5 or 10 minute just discussion on how we fit within this whole thing.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so are we ready to move on to the next topic? We're gonna let Cole and Lauren and Sam off their hot seats.
All right. Thanks, Cole. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
All right, our next topic is on bike racks, and
it's
also,
on Prairie Dog
also
Trail.
known as our Sawhill Pond Improvement Project.
Yeah, and I'll say just a couple things as Eileen and Bill are getting started.
Yeah, come on up.
Yeah. So, first of all, just want to introduce Eileen Flax, that you're all pretty familiar with. She's been presenting some of our projects, and Bill Wildenberg is also one of our landscape architects. And just to tie all this together, they're currently working on capital projects that were identified last year, and one of those is Sawhill Ponds. It really touches, like we just talked about, equity, accessibility, parking. There are bike racks involved, you'll hear about. But it's a great project. It also demonstrates working with other city departments. And so we've talked a little bit about how can we be efficient as a city and do great work for one community, one Boulder. And that's where we've taken advantage of an opportunity here at Sawhill. There's been a utility project going on. You'll hear about it as we talk about the sewer replacement. But we use that as an opportunity to redo Sawhill Ponds and improve the area. The last thing I want to mention too, you know, this ties back to the OSBT. You had your priorities for 24 that I think you sent to council and then also mentioned to staff. One of those was, again, equity, access. We talked about bike parking. So this project touches on that. The Sawhill Ponds is a really unique place. The other thing I'll just say before we get started, I don't want to draw the connection to CU South, but in some regards, as we've been talking about CU South, Sawhill is similar. It's a gravel mining operation that was somewhat been restored. I don't want to go too far in that in terms of the ecological values, but it is an example of, I think the board has been asking, like, what's CU South in the future? You know, if it's restored and repaired and all that great stuff, how could the community enjoy that? So Sawhill Ponds is one of those kind of places where we've seen past mining activity, and now we have a recreation place that equally as important is to understand the ecology of the site and restore a riparian area and habitat and all those ecological values. So are we ready to go?
Je-
Perfect. Right on time.
Jeff, Bill, and Eileen, do you want us to hold questions to the end? Or do you want us to? Okay. Okay. And I did
I'm happy
see
to be
Bill show
interrupted,
up on his
honestly.
bike, so want to commend him for doing that.
Uh-oh. Where's your mouse? There you go. Yeah, I got my notes. Do you need notes? Yeah. There's covered down here. There's 3 little spots.
Should we tell some dad jokes or something while we're doing this? Because I feel like Harmon and I have our own little bantering going on. He's going to start taking his bike helmet to every meeting now, just to make it look like he biked here. You know, but he's just going to carry his helmet to make it give us the appearance
It's
that he
all
rode
in it,
here.
Thank you for your patience here. We'll just locate you at Sawhill Ponds. So can you advance to the next one? Yeah. So Sawhill Ponds is kind of out east, just west of 75th Street and north of the railroad. It is in the Boulder Creek corridor, and that whole area was mined out for gravel. It used to be the town of Valmont, which is to the west. And then all of those farms that made up that important community sold their gravel, and the area became ponds, and then those ponds are now wildlife preserves. So we have Sawhill Ponds, and then just north of us is the county's property, Walden Ponds, and just to the west of that is the Fort Chambers Poor Farm property, which is also some of these gravel ponds. We also have the wastewater treatment facility that's just north of the Walden Ponds, and that's a key piece of this project. Thank you. Next slide. Sawhill Ponds is a natural area, is the management designation, and that means we try to accommodate low impact visitor activities where we can and protect the resource and provide recreation there. Next. So the property is actually owned by Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and it's managed by OSMP through an agreement that dates back to 1983. We've been in it for a long time. And we have commitments to CPW through that include the fishing pier for the Fishing is Fun project, a bird viewing blind, picnic tables, accessible restroom, accessible parking, and then signed nature trails. And so we need to honor those commitments, and some of the facilities have really degraded over time. And so we needed to move forward with those. Next. So when the city started working on their main sewer replacement project, it became a good opportunity to leverage those improvements for our site improvements. So the phase 2 of their line goes through the south and east legs of the main loop of the Sawhill Ponds. And so as part of that project, their contractor was responsible for restoring the trail along those 2 legs of the main loop. We added to that project to restore the entire loop and the leg to the trailhead. And that included also some drainage improvements and slope stabilizations in that area as well. Next, please. We were ready to move forward in a real decisive way because our education and outreach program had worked through a framework of desired program improvements that would support their efforts. And so we had some really clear ideas between our commitments for CPW and this education and outreach framework of the direction we wanted to head when we were looking at the work that was being done at the site. And all of that could really support so many of our master plan strategies, particularly around responsible recreation stewardship and enjoyment and community connections, education and inclusion. And so we looked at a lot of these strategies that we're able to address. Next, please. So the site improvements included in our work at Sawhill Ponds include restoring the driveway. We're not putting in a whole new roadway, but we are restoring that roadway and addressing some at the driveway connection to 75th, addressing some county requirements to narrow it down. We are renovating the trailhead, yay, and putting in a new fishing pier. We're replacing the vault restroom, and then over in a little further into the site as you get still close to the trailhead, but a little ways in, we're replacing the bird blind and putting in a nature discovery area, kind of like what we talked about at South Mesa last month. And then we're putting in accessible benches around that whole loop.
And bike racks.
No bike racks around the loop because there's no biking at the site. Next, please. So in terms of trails and accessibility, we were able to renovate all of those trails around the whole main trail loop to meet accessibility, the Forest Service trail accessibility guideline criteria. Previously, the trail had been uneven and the surfacing wasn't accessible. And then again, we're putting in these accessible benches that have backs and armrests at a number of locations around that whole loop trail. When we look at our trailheads, we look at them holistically. They're more than just parking lots, and we look at a whole spectrum of factors that we, again, like we talked about last month at Marshall and South Mesa. And we're working on wayfinding and looking at that transition between the built environment and open space and helping people make that transition, demonstrating wise stewardship at the trailhead. And so all of what we're doing there cues the leave no trace behaviors and set people up for success on the system. Next. So at our trailhead, we have the driveway entrance coming into a formalized parking area. It's going to have concrete curb and gutter and aggregate surfacing. There's accessible parking spaces, and from those accessible parking spaces, there's access to the north up to the existing shelter and to the new fishing pier and back into the site trails, to the system trails and connection to that the new vault restroom. There's a way for buses to come into the site, which is an important piece of programming for larger groups. So there's a bus turnaround and parking, and at that west side of the bus turnaround, there's a gathering area. So when people come together, people get off the bus or they're waiting, they have a place to gather, and that includes benches and some boulders and some trees and bike racks. And just a way to make that transition into the open space. We're also formalizing kind of towards the east side of this area some head-in parking spaces. This was a request from our rangers who were having trouble with visitors wanting to park and stay overnight, kind of parking under the tree. And so they requested head-in parking. And so we formalized that area with some picnic tables as well. All disturbed areas will be restored, and we're including some different plantings within the rain gardens, which are treating water runoff from the parking lot and the center islands, the bus turnaround island in the center, and then climate ready plantings around the shelter and around the kind of between the gathering area and the vault restroom. We're replacing the fishing pier with something that is maybe not as aesthetically pleasing as what was there before. But this floating dock allows us to really limit our impacts to the wetland and the floodplain. We're using this dock. The floating dock is recycled plastic, and it's much less expensive. So this demonstrates wise use of resources. It also lets the dock really float right on the water, and so you can get really close to the water that way and remain accessible at whatever water level we have there. We have a similar dock at KOA, and it's been working great. Everybody's really happy with it, and in the upper right-hand corner is kind of the layout of how our dock is going to look. There are two structures associated with the trailhead. One is the shade shelter. We're going to leave that one in place and just repaint it because it's serving all our needs. The vault restroom will be replaced with a 2-seater, but with the same finishes that are on the new ones at Centennial. And we will be doing a lot of planting. A lot of new cottonwoods are going in to support the cottonwoods that are there, kind of successional plantings. And then we'll have a whole bunch of beautiful climate ready plantings that we hope to inspire people to take our native plantings and see how they could be appropriate in a built environment, and inspire them to take that kind of planting palette home with them. Again, we'll be restoring with all native seed any disturbed areas in the area. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
I'm going to cover the nature discovery area, and it started with a planning process. It was to design an area that is light on the land, and it was designed to be a program space for our E&O staff to foster a youth connection with nature. The Sawhill Ponds is a Boulder Youth Nature Initiative site. We have one of 2 of those sites at OSMP, and there's 6 sites total across the city. So this is an important pilot project looking at how to connect youth to nature. And I kind of got ahead of myself. It's also a tier 2 master plan strategy. It's a direct connection of connect youth to nature. Next slide, please. What we want to distinguish is that nature discovery is not nature play. Nature play has a lot of structure and a lot of more play-like elements. This one will be not distinguishable when there's not a program in place. So the program is really supporting the use of these natural materials in a way that kids might not find on their own, but it's not a play space. It is a nature discovery space. The 2 images shown, the one on the right is actually right by Sombrero Marsh. It's at the Thorn Nature Center, and the one on the left is at Woodbriar Park in Greeley. Next slide, please. this is the site plan for the nature discovery area. The upper dark spot is where we'll have a new bird blind. There's an existing one right now, which will be replaced. We're going to have logs, stumps, boulders, mounds for this nature discovery. And we're also going to designate a trail loop where right now there's an undesignated trail. It'll closely follow the existing undesignated alignment, but not exactly. There'll be water access in what's shown on the kind of the northwest area, and it's currently being used for that today. And there will also be, by designating this trail, there'll be views of the water in this general area. Next slide, please. This was one of our areas in the CPW agreement. This is the existing bird blind. It does have incredible views, but the structure that's there is one of the walls is leaning. It's got nails poking through the ceiling. It really needs to be replaced. So we're looking at something that'll be a little bit more fun than this structure. And you can go to the next slide, please. And this is the current thought on our new bird blind. And what it's doing is incorporating bird blind panels that are actually laser cut from, it can be aluminum or steel. We're doing aluminum, but what it's doing is using birds that can be seen on the site and using that for the bird blind design. It'll provide programming space. It has seating built in around it, protection from rain, wind, and it'll have wildlife viewing. I'm going to just name a couple of the programs just so you're familiar with how this will support the area. There's storytime hikes, fishing is fun, Little Explorers, seasonal change in wildlife, Colorado ecosystems, and our roll and stroll program. So that's all the programs that are going to be supported in this area. And 2 of these programs support a BVSD school curriculum as well. And next slide, please. Moving on from nature discovery, I'm also going to talk about science and interpretation. And if you didn't know, I used to be the former science and graphics program manager, so it makes sense I'm talking about this. And one of Sarah's questions is, how do we support people with diverse backgrounds? This is one of the areas we do that. And this was a pilot project that we developed in 2020 that we're going to advance a little bit further. And what we did here is we looked at what our signs are today and what our maps are today. And they're highly regulation based. And this pilot project looked at using more of a graphic based representation of our regulations. And it also looked at our maps and tried to make it more of a wayfinding map than a regulation map as well. And this also aligns with the Tier 1 master plan strategy of enhanced communication with visitors. Next slide, please. This is just a before after of what the phase 1 of this program did. And you can see on the left, there's a very text heavy rules and regulations as you're coming into each spot. And the new signs use a very graphic representation of those same regulations. So you can glance at it and hopefully get a sense of what you can and can't do versus trying to read to regulation number 36 that says you get a free prize if you've gotten this far. Next slide, please. Beyond our graphics focused signs, we'll have educational signage at the fishing dock and bird blind, and we're going to update the regulations at ponds 1A and 1B to be in alignment with our existing management agreement with CPW. And that states that dogs must be on a leash at all times here. And next slide. And this is where we're at in the process right now. We are planning to open the ponds again following the sewer line construction just for a bit. And then we will close them for construction. And when we reopen, it'll be a much better place. So thank you for listening. And
I'm gonna add to that the we'll be able to leave the trails open while the construction is taking place with access from Walden Ponds. So visitors won't be able to access through our trailhead, but because the sites are connected, they'll be able to access through there.
Thank you.
And you can
Thanks.
advance to the thank you slide.
Thank you. Do we have any questions and comments about this presentation? John? I
did. So I'm going to start reading to the end of every sign now to see if there's a free prize at the end. So I'm no bird blind expert, but the bird blind design you showed looked very different from any bird blind I've seen, given I haven't seen a lot of them. Will that function as a bird blind, being that open, or are there any concerns around that? I've never seen one quite like that.
There are many different types of bird blind designs, and I'll just say that this is more of a practice bird blind for kids. It's really youth centered. You're not hiding from it as much, and you don't really want the serious birders interacting with the noisy kids. So this is intended to be more of a practice bird blind and used as a programming space just as much as a practice bird blind.
Awesome. Thank you. It sounds like you've put a lot of thought into that.
Yep.
Any others? Oh, go ahead, Herman.
So, yeah, it's an amazing place. Spent a lot of time there. And sometimes, and you mentioned it with the shallow water and stuff during warmer times of the year and water levels go down, you get a lot of algae, and Sawhill Ponds doesn't always look or smell the most attractive. Is there anything around the plantings or some of the restoration work or BMPs that you guys are thinking of putting in that might improve water quality throughout the year?
Really, our plantings are not going to have much of an impact on the ponds. The fishing pier is moving to the west because that pond is more full, just the way the ponds are balanced during the year. So that's the reason for that there's better fishing on that pond, to the east.
Yeah, I'll give
Yes.
Heather a chance to come up. This improvement project is not focused such as on Don D'Amico's restoration of those gravel ponds out on the Erdl property or the CU South restoration. This is not really addressing that, or the Fort Chambers Poor Farm property, which we'll bring to you later this summer, has more of an aggressive restoration of the actual ponds themselves. So that's sort of outside the scope of this project, but and Heather might be able to.
Yeah, I mean, that covered a lot of it. There also are challenges out here with the water rights and how the water gets to the ponds. So we don't have as much control as it would be nice to have over freshwater coming out. Water coming out of the ponds and freshwater going into the ponds. And that's something that our water staff has been working on for, gosh, probably 2 decades, I bet. And the situation has gotten a little bit better, but especially in years where there isn't a lot of water to go around, we don't have a whole lot of control over it.
Thanks for that.
Anything else? Oh, thank you. I just want to also thank you for bringing fishing back. I know that's been gone for like 5 years, and my kids are kind of aging out of fishing, but they really, really enjoyed that.
You can never age out of fishing.
Other years. Well, yeah, that's true. Well, getting them out. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Oh, one more slide.
I really like the signs as well. I'll add to what everybody else has said here. The signs do feel really nice. I like that there's what you can do and what you can't do. I like seeing the bilingual Spanish and English. And overall, the site is really, really lovely. It feels, I also appreciate the discovery versus play. And then that sort of educational component. It feels like you've got the full, kind of the full thing going on there. So lovely.
Thank you. I don't want Brady reminded me that, it got 9 o'clock. So.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, we're doing okay.
We're doing
We've got
okay.
a 25 minutes, and I don't have any director updates, so
Oh, okay.
feed that into your equation.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Bill.
All right, thank you all. Well, we're going to carry on with our last matters of the evening, and that is to wet your whistle and give you a high-level overview of our upcoming Climbing Access Trail Management update, which we heard a little bit at public comment today, which was a nice segue into this. But Jeff, you get us started on that subject?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I'm just going to say two quick things while we're transitioning staff. First of all, it was great to have Kate here during public comment earlier to kind of start to preview what we're about to discuss. And I did want to introduce formally Lisa Gonzalo, who's going to be presenting remotely. She's actually at a conference this week, and so took time to kind of join this evening. There's a couple key things. I mean, this project, Climbing Access Management, in fact, Heather and I both sponsor this. It's a great example of interdisciplinary staff team working on a complex topic. It's as much about climbing access, or I should say it's as much about ecological values as it is climbing access. We're trying to kind of find a balance and approach to understand both an approved recreation activity, but how that looks on the landscape and how we can kind of balance that with our ecological values. And then secondly, kind of as Dan mentioned, this is just a high level kind of initial overview. We're just getting started on the project. We don't have any key outcomes or recommendations, or so here's what we've come up with. This is really to make sure you all as the trustees are understanding the work that we're up to and kind of when we'll come back. And then again, I keep talking about the key issues that you guys kind of decide upon for this year. And I think someone actually prioritized this within the OSBT issues under that kind of recreation management, climbing access. So we're excited to kind of bring that forward. So I think Lisa's geared up and ready to go, and I'll let her take over. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks for letting me be here to introduce this project that I think we're all pretty excited about kicking off this year, looking at climbing access management. Next slide, please. So our agenda today, we intend to cover the history, just a brief introduction to the history of climbing in Boulder, the guidance and goals that drive this project, the existing conditions on the ground, and how we kind of see how management of existing climbing access trails plays out currently. Want to introduce the application process through the FCC Review Committee and our partners in the Flatirons Climbing Council, as well as the scope of the project. Next slide. So I want to start by acknowledging the legacy that climbing has had within the open space and mountain parks backdrop. The first known ascent of the third Flatiron occurred in 1906 by Floyd and Earl Millard on the standard east face. And we believe that to be the earliest recorded rock climb in Colorado history. In 1919 was the earliest known roped ascent, meaning that that first ascent was a free solo. And in the 1900s, you begin to see the emergence of recreational groups gathering together to have a recreational opportunity on the land. And as we talk about multimodal access, we're maybe missing the boat on having donkeys up to these destinations. Image from 1919 of a hike to the Royal Arch from a Rocky Mountain Climbers Club organized to get to that destination. And on the right-hand side, in 1900, image of a gentleman just glassing the view from Bear Mountain. And you can tell the difference in the landscape and when this first began compared to where we are today. Next slide, please. So the why behind the project couldn't be more described than what is written within the visitor master plan. And so I'll just kind of go ahead and read this slide. But it calls for us to collaborate with the climbing community to develop a system of climbing access trails that provide sustainable access to desired destinations. And this action involves an evaluation of existing undesignated trails with defined criteria, decisions on which trails to designate, close, or improve, as well as the restoration of natural resources damaged by historically unsustainable access. Next slide, please. And the guidance from the VMP really calls for this dual chartered purpose initiative, which is to find a balance between how we support climbing as an approved passive recreational activity, as well as further protecting the natural resources. We know that the climbing formations tend to be in areas that we want to make sure that we are being careful to not damage the resource. They're in highly sensitive areas that include raptor nesting as well. So we do have seasonal closures for those things. And so we want to be cognizant of both the recreational and the ecological opportunities in these areas. Through the designation process, we want to explore formally providing access to these climbing formations. We, again, recognize a legacy of climbing. We want that to be an opportunity for future generations, and designation provides a more formal way of providing that access. We'd also like to proactively manage climbing access trails, so being able to address issues within the maintenance of these trails as they come up, close and restore existing undesignated trails when appropriate, bring existing signage into alignment and therefore decluttering the system. Work closely with our core team and stakeholders. We have a staff core team of subject matter experts that have been identified that represent both the recreational and ecological worlds to come together and not only develop these goals, but develop the outcomes. And then I've mentioned our stakeholders, very important in the climbing community, Flatirons Climbing Council, as well as the Boulder climbing community. And with that, we want to explore the possibility of developing a framework and process to inform future climbing access designation. Next slide, please. So what is undesignated versus designated? Just wanted to spend a slide explaining a little bit of the difference. Undesignated trails have not gone through a formal process to become designated. Historically, that has been through a planning process. And when you look at climbing access, predominantly found within the West Trail Study Area Plan. And so undesignated trails are therefore created and worn into the landscape mostly by visitors, but we do see some proliferation of undesignated trails that began perhaps through wildlife, a deer trail, or perhaps a cattle trail, particularly in the east. But then that attracts the interest of hikers and visitors that they see a trail going off the beaten path and wonder, oh, I wonder what the destination is. Is there a nice viewpoint over there? And so they kind of perpetuate the problem of proliferating undesignated trails. So conversely, designated trails are those which have been designated through a formal process, and then they are assigned a wayfinding sign, a trail name, and then they are therefore brought into our trails maintenance program. Next slide. So climbing access trails are obviously a subset of our larger trail system, and they are there to serve the climbing community that we recognize might have a different desired experience on those trails as opposed to, say, a casual hiker. And so we have a trail monitoring program, and through that program, we have monitored 10.3 miles of climbing access trails. 3.3 miles of those have been officially designated, and we maintain them and sign them as has been directed. 7 miles of those are undesignated, and just to make things a little bit more confusing, 1 mile of those 7 have already gotten specific plan guidance to designate. And so part of this process is to define what designating climbing access trails means, particularly because the climbing community might have a different visitor use experience than a different recreator on our system. And our current scope we identified as 2.4 miles, and I'll get into a little bit more detail of why we're starting off with that number and where that number came from. Next slide. So we see the management, a little bit of confusion in the number of trail miles that are undesignated or designated. And we see that translate into our system. And this is an array of examples of our climbing access signs. We do have an OSMP approved signs manual that guides the color, the icons, the locations, the placement of every passive recreational activity in open space, from dogs to equestrians. And climbing access, because it's in this little bit of a vague world, does not have that. And so there are no existing signs guidelines for climbing access. And that's one area that we've identified we could do a lot better in terms of educating not only the climbing community, but the casual hiker as well, to say, you know, this is an out and back, most likely a steeper hill than what you might expect, and to keep, you know, the education of our visitors in line with what we would expect on these trails versus a designated hiking trail. Next slide. So this is an example of an image of the slab that was generated from our monitoring program. And so that entails Jake Engelman going out and hiking each one of these trails and measuring them. And so now we can see them on a map. So for example, the brown trail on the right, and I apologize, this is a little hard to see. We might need to squint a little bit, but the right-hand side has a brown designated trail. The orange trails that you see both on the east and the west side of the slab, are undesignated climbing access trails. The red triangles are photo points along the trail. And so this is an interactive map that in-house we're able to, when it's on a screenshot, we can click on each triangle and they might display certain characteristics of the trail, images of when that trail was monitored in terms of the condition, as well as potential infrastructure that may exist like a sign or a wag bag station. The purple line is where we get these 2.4 miles. And so we have, and I'll get a little more detail coming up next, but we have collaborated with our FCC stakeholders to say, this is how we would like you to get to your destination. They recommend, yes, this is great. This is the most direct. This is how we would like to get here. And so the purple line represents that kind of approval that we have in communication, even though it's not formally designated. We have an approval process that I'll get into next to explain how that purple line came to be. But that is how we understand with the climbing community, that's how they would, and we would approve for them to get to the slab, in this case, as their destination. One other thing I wanted to point out, we mentioned that these are in sensitive habitat areas. We wanted to be careful about identifying areas where there are opportunities to close and restore undesignated trails, perhaps, or designate them conversely. But in the top left corner, you can see a raptor closure that was in effect from February 1st to July 31st. And so raptors are one of the things that we work very closely with our climbing community, adaptively managed, so that if the nesting attempt isn't successful, we do lift those closures early than might have been if they were successful. But obviously we do want to see the success of these raptors. And so we have open lines of communication with our stakeholders to make sure that we all kind of understand what the expectation is with the raptor closures and when they're lifted as well. Next slide. So in 2003, we entered into a memorandum of understanding with the FCC, and this allowed them a permitting process to replace existing hardware, and that is for primarily safety concerns. If hardware is failing, they can submit a permit with an image of what they're showing as the issue to be, as well as a recommendation for how to fix it. And we say, great, that's wonderful. Please continue for the safety for our climbing community. Love to see it. The other piece of this is allowing for the placement of new fixed anchors in the flat irons. And so this allows the climbing community to expand their sport and experiences by having new bolted routes approved through this MOU process. Next slide. So just an example of one of the applications we might get. So a climber might have a really great idea for a new bolted route on an approved formation. Part of the application process since 2013, it's seen different iterations, but since 2013 has included a request for the climber to say how they would recommend that they get to their climbing destination. So here's an example of one of the more recent ones that we've gotten that just shows where you would take off from, in this case, the Mesa Trail. And then the dotted line shows where their destination is, which is the Shanahan Crag. And this is reviewed by subject matter experts on the FCC review committee within open space. And we look at this and say, great, this is consistent with previous guidance that we've given. And this is how the 2.4 miles of approval have happened. And so climbing community says, we'd like to go here. Staff says, wonderful, we quote unquote approve it. But it always has fallen short of designation. And so these are the 2.4 miles that are within the scope of this current project, to see how the conversations will go, to see if designation is the appropriate next step. What does this define designation and what that would mean for climbing access, and go through that process with a limited scope that we can then perhaps translate, if it's successful, to the remaining undesignated trails for climbing access. Next slide. This is the breakdown of the 2.4 miles. On the left-hand side, I mentioned earlier that we had a mile of climbing access trails that were called to be designated already. Those are the Maiden, the Matron, and the Slab. Sections of the Mickey Mouse climbing access trail have also already been designated. And so we'd be looking at a fraction of that for the remainder up to the tunnel. The middle column has the names for each of these areas, and on the right is the length in miles. And so this is the 2.4 miles of what we would look to have discussions around designation just to start. Next slide. So we have an anticipated project schedule. I was lucky enough to meet with Kate and Rui with the FCC and the BCC last month. We think that we can pull together our first working group meeting in June. And then our goals are to complete the staff working group recommendations with our stakeholder involvement by the end of 2024, and then touch back with the board in Q4, with implementation projected to begin as early as 2025. Next slide. I have listed the goals again. I got to them pretty early, so I just wanted to make sure that you had a chance to review the goals again after going through a little bit more of the thought process of the project. And I am happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you for that, Lisa and Jeff. I want to open it to my fellow trustees for questions. But before we do that, I just want to state for the public record that my employer is the Access Fund, and they're a national advocacy organization for climbing. And Brady used to be the executive director. But we focus on the national area. They're not going to be weighing in on this topic. So as I do weigh in on this topic, I just want it to be on the record that I'm doing so as a private citizen of the city of Boulder, and who happens to also be a climber. So just wanted to say that, and then open it up for questions and comments. Sounds like Brady's on.
Yeah. Great presentation, Lisa. Thank you. The thinking makes sense. I guess two questions. One is, how sure are you that the 10 point whatever mile inventory is complete? It would seem to me that there's always going to be a trail that's, is that a social trail? Is that an access trail? Or is there some gray area that maybe you're not capturing? And is that a concern, number one? And then number two, when we approve, or when you approve a trail, what does that mean? Is it, because you're not going to maintain it to the standard that you would other trails. And so is there some kind of internal policy change? Do we need to officially define a new kind of designation? So anyway, those are just two initial kind of questions.
Yeah, I think, part of the challenge, like we're looking at bolted route formations. And so we understand that there's also bouldering opportunities and scrambling opportunities. And so I think, that is where our discussions with the climbing community are really important to understand if this does truly capture all of the undesignated trails within our climbing trail system. We believe it to be pretty accurate at this point, but there is always kind of, these thinking around, is it the final definition, and things on the ground are always changing as well. And so it is something that we continue to monitor and adjust over time. So if that can help answer the first question. And remind me the second question.
What does it mean when it's approved or designated? And do we need to, is there some kind of new definition that we need to formalize? And, is there a possibility that the public will see a designated trail and then realize, wait a second, this doesn't feel like a regular, OSMP trail?
Great question. So the MOU that we have with the FCC is how we have gone through this approval process. And so through that MOU, it dictates the kind of conditions and expectations for how someone would submit an application to review this. And so the way we've been operating is that we've never tied, this approval process to designation. We've had said in the past that, we understand this is how you want to get to your destination. And we say that's probably the least impactful and the most direct for the climbing community, then that sounds wonderful. And so designation, if it is appropriate for climbing access trails, would have to be reviewed by our trail management objectives to make sure that we don't want necessarily to maintain these to the level of kind of a hiker trail, because again, the climbing community is going to, I think, and this is something we'll dive into a little bit through the project, but want a different experience. From what we understand preliminarily, climbers want to get to their destination as quickly as possible, which means that it would be less desirable for a climbing access trail to provide a number of switchbacks to lessen the elevation gain, in a shorter amount of time. But those are all things that I think we want to explore, how designation would apply to climbing access trails in a different way than they would for a hiking trail.
Harmon.
Yeah, so I had basically exactly the same question that Brady had, and I want to ask it again, maybe in a little different way. Is there some obligation that OSMP has when OSMP designates a trail to maintain it to a certain standard?
So it depends on the trail type. And so I don't work in trails, but Jeff might be able to speak to that a little bit more in terms of the different standards that we have for our trails maintenance objectives.
Yeah, I mean, we could spend the whole evening on our our management objectives. We call them TMOs. It's basically a classification type, and it's a system that's used. Again, I would invite our trail staff to come and talk. It's very interesting. But we basically look at who's the user. Is it a hiker? Is it equestrian? Is it a biker? In this case, is it a climber? And then we look at different grades within there. Do we want it a very accessible type trail? The surfacing is very smooth. There's no rocks in the tread and all that kind of stuff. So I think what we're getting at is these climbing access trails. In some regards, we want to, like Lisa's mentioning, we want to keep them in the kind of current state that they are supporting climbing access. Just like she said, someone wants to get to the crag as quickly as possible. But instead of all these braided proliferation of different ways to get there, say, oh, here's the route that you should use or that we agree upon. And then that allows us to restore the other areas. Those trails wouldn't be like the Mesa Trail, or like these trails we're talking about at Sawhill. They would be still rocky, probably some level of scrambling involved. And quite frankly, like she said, some of these ecologically sensitive areas, we don't necessarily want to attract a lot of people to. It's more of a defined user group. So these are all the things. It's hard to answer in a lot of ways because, like we said, this is a very introductory presentation. In fact, we're kind of working through this as a staff. Do we sign these trails? Yeah. What level of maintenance would be warranted? Do we put them on maps? Those kind of things. So those are all the pieces and parts we're working through. But I think the simple, if we were to say designated, doesn't mean all of a sudden it's smooth and surfaced and like you'd see around the Chautauqua Meadow or something in that regard.
Yeah, because I think, the aim of the question was, I think most of us, from judging from the sort of taking the temperature of the board, could agree that minimizing the amount of braiding and social trail creation that takes place is a good thing. Designating climbing access trails would help to minimize that kind of braiding and creation of social trails. Maybe even putting them on the map would. And that having consistent signage, think like the Jumpman for Air Jordan, create like the climber and say this is a climbing access trail and it's not maintained. It's, steep and rocky and, it's not a recommended hiking trail. Just put that on the, on the signpost. Could go a long way towards, sort of standardizing climbing access and helping us really just minimize the amount of degradation that we see on non-designated trails.
Yeah, exactly. And we would equate it like right now, one of our designation or TMO classifications is like a hiker 1. And it's basically a lot of that. I mean, it can be as narrow, as we want it. In this case, we would look at the corridor and make sure, there is a clear path, but not clear the corridor where we take out shrubs and trees and vegetation to achieve that, what's warranted for the climber access. As Lisa mentioned, there are a few areas that have been designated, and that's just like you've described, Harmon. There's signage. In fact, I think we even described that it's almost like climbing access only, which is a little interesting because I don't think we have regulatory standards set up yet to actually enforce if someone were to be up there, how do we know if we're a
Right.
climber?
Are you a climber? Are you
Yeah,
allowed to be
so
here?
again, those are some of the challenges we're working through as a staff team to make sure this is enforceable and workable.
Yeah. And, maybe, thinking about what the trail maintenance, the TMO, the standards are going to be for climbing access trails. Maybe the maintenance standard is we sign it and we blaze it. So, we try to keep people on the route. And that's it. And then whatever happens to the trail happens to the trail. I don't know. I'm just, throwing something out there.
Yeah.
Just two more observations. I mean, I think one thing we've seen in the climbing community is sustainable trail alignment changes with usage. So, when climbing wasn't as popular, you could make a beeline up the hill, through vegetation, and it wasn't too bad, right? And then as things get more popular, you have to take management actions sometimes. I just want to say also, as a former professional climbing advocate, I've seen a lot of interaction between, government entities and the climbing community, and this is exemplary. It was a great, organized, upbeat presentation. Lisa, y'all are working with the FCC, the BCC. You're taking off a bite-sized chunk, going to try it out. I just think this is exemplary. So I love the tone and the approach, and there's a lot of communities around the country that'd be really lucky to have something like this in their backyard. So kudos, good luck. I think you're working with the right people with BCC and FCC. I think you're going to come up with some great approaches to this.
Yeah, thank you. And Lisa's a great project manager, kind of facilitating this. And I just want to give kudos to all that. We've got a variety of staff that are on this internal team that are doing really good work. So yeah, I'd echo that.
I think Brady covered what I wanted to say. So John, Sarah, do you want to weigh in? Okay, well, all right, it's 9:02. No, this said 8:45, but that's okay.
We got started 2 minutes late, and I think we
That's
actually
true.
did.
So we had to have a body break. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to adjourn tonight's meeting then. Thank you. Good call.